She was the nurse no one looked at twice. Every morning, Claire Donovan walked through the automatic doors of Vantage Point Medical Center in Creston Falls, Colorado, put on her scrubs, and disappeared into the background of a hospital that had already decided what she was worth. The senior surgeons talked over her. The charge nurses scheduled her for the worst shifts. The attending physicians handed her tasks like she was furniture that had learned to carry things. Nobody asked where she came from. Nobody asked what she had done before. That was exactly how she wanted it. But the morning the first military helicopter crested the ridgeline east of town, banking hard toward the hospital roof, with its lights strobing through the early gray dawn, Claire Donovan was standing at the medication cart on the third floor, and something in her body went cold and absolutely still before the sound even reached her ears. She knew that approach pattern. She had seen it in places these people had never heard of, in darkness that had no name on any map. And she already knew, before anyone else in that building understood what was coming, that the next few hours were going to change everything. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the stories on this channel do not slow down. Every week we bring you cinematic drama that will keep you on the edge of your seat from the first second to the last. Drop a like on this video and tell me in the comments, what city, what country are you watching from right now? I want to see exactly how far these stories are traveling. Now let's go back to Creston Falls, Colorado, and to the woman nobody saw coming. The shift had started at 5:45 in the morning, which was typical for Claire. She had requested early rotations months ago, and the charge nurse, a heavy-set woman named Dolores Vane, had granted the request with the particular kind of satisfied smile that meant she considered it a punishment. "Third floor med-surg again," Dolores had said, sliding the schedule across the desk without looking up. "You're not cleared for trauma rotation." "I know," Claire had said. "Dr. Harwick made that clear after last week." "I know." "So we're not going to have another situation where you walk into the trauma bay uninvited and start—" "No, ma'am." Dolores had looked up then, studying Claire with the focused suspicion of someone trying to catch a lie and finding nothing to catch. Claire had held her gaze, neutral, patient, giving her nothing. "Good," Dolores had finally said. "Keep your head down." Claire was good at that. She had been keeping her head down for 2 years, 11 months, and roughly 16 days at Vantage Point Medical Center. Not that she was counting in any deliberate way, but the numbers surfaced sometimes, the way certain numbers did when you had trained yourself to track duration out of operational habit. Almost 3 years of quiet shifts, careful invisibility, and the particular kind of exhaustion that came not from working too hard but from working hard while pretending to work less than you were capable of. She had taken the position here because Creston Falls was the kind of place that didn't attract attention. A mountain town with a regional medical center, a tourist economy that peaked in ski season and bottomed out in mud season, and a population of roughly 40,000 people who mostly left each other alone. The hospital was well funded by regional standards, staffed by physicians who had come here for the quality of life and stayed for the skiing, and organized by the kind of institutional hierarchy that rewarded confidence over competence, title over talent, and volume over precision. Dr. Marcus Harwick was the chief of trauma surgery, and he was exactly what that environment produced. Claire had encountered men like him before, not the specific variety. Harwick was an educated man, well-credentialed, legitimately skilled in certain narrow technical senses. But the shape of him was familiar. The way he occupied space, the way his voice changed register depending on who he was talking to, dropping into something warm and collegial when addressing attendings and nurses who mattered, shifting to flat dismissal when aimed at anyone he'd already categorized as beneath his concern. The way he had looked at Claire on her first day, taken in the quiet demeanor, the lack of aggressive credential announcing that the other nurses sometimes used as armor, and assigned her a category she hadn't been able to dislodge in nearly 3 years. "You've got good hands," he had told her once, early on, with the tone of someone complimenting a technician rather than a clinician. "Stick to what you're assigned, and we'll get along fine." She had smiled and said thank you and gone back to her station. She had not told him what those hands had done before. The third-floor med-surg ward at 5:45 in the morning was the quietest place in the building. Most patients were between the thin sleep that hospitals allowed and the anxious wakefulness of another hospital morning. The overnight nursing staff were finishing their charting with the focused tunnel vision of people who needed to get home. The PA system was mercifully quiet. The lighting was still on its nighttime setting, which meant the corridor was lit in the orange-yellow spectrum that someone had apparently decided was easier on recovering patients, but that Claire had always privately found slightly unreal, like operating inside an old photograph. She moved through the ward with the economy of motion that had become second nature years before she arrived here, checking vitals, reviewing charts on the rolling terminal, catching the small things that the night staff sometimes missed, not from negligence but from the accumulated blur of a 12-hour overnight. In room 312, the patient in the window bed had rolled onto the IV site in his left forearm, and the drip was slightly compromised. She adjusted his position, resecured the line, noted it. In room 317, a woman recovering from an appendectomy was awake and frightened, not in a way she was going to tell anyone, just watching the ceiling with wide eyes and shallow breath. And Claire stopped in the doorway long enough to catch the woman's eye and hold it until the breathing evened out. No words necessary. In room 320, a man named Harold Pruitt, who had been admitted with a post-surgical complication from knee replacement, was, characteristically, already awake and already annoyed. "You're not my regular nurse," Harold said. "No, sir, I'm Claire. I've got you for this shift. The young one usually comes in at 6. She brings me the good pudding." "I can get you pudding." Harold squinted at her. He was 71, a retired high school football coach whose face had been weathered into a kind of permanent skeptical squint, and he deployed this expression indiscriminately. "What kind?" "Whatever's in the cart. Probably vanilla or chocolate. I like butterscotch. I'll see what I can do." Harold grunted, which she was learning to read as his version of thank you, and settled back against his pillow. Claire finished checking his vitals, noted the overnight readings looked stable, confirmed the drain output from the knee was within normal parameters, and moved on. This was the work. The actual daily substance of it. Not the dramatic intervention, not the crisis, but the sustained presence, the watching, the adjusting, the patient accumulation of small, correct decisions that kept people alive long enough to recover. Claire was good at it. She had always been good at it, in the specific way that came from understanding that the small decisions were never actually small, that the untreated anxiety in room 317 and the compromised IV drip in 312 were each their own category of risk, and that the nurse who treated those observations as interruptions rather than the actual content of the job was the nurse who eventually faced a different kind of crisis at 3 in the morning. She had learned this in a context that nothing in this hospital would have recognized. She did not think about that context unless she had to. She had constructed her life here around not thinking about it, around the pudding and the vitals and the medication cart and the careful daily business of being unremarkable, being forgettable, being the nurse nobody looked at twice. At 6:14 in the morning, her radio crackled. Not the floor radio, her personal radio, the one clipped to the inside of her scrub pocket, the one nobody at Vantage Point knew she carried or had asked about in 3 years. It wasn't a station anyone here would have been monitoring. Claire stepped into the supply closet at the end of the corridor and pulled it out. The signal was weak through the building's walls, but she caught enough. Encrypted military traffic, compressed burst transmissions, the specific cadence of emergency coordination rather than routine communication. She wasn't supposed to have the capability to receive this anymore. Technically, she had returned the hardware when she separated. Technically. She listened for 40 seconds, then closed it off and stood in the supply closet surrounded by sealed saline bags and the smell of antiseptic, breathing carefully through the specific kind of controlled calm that her body still knew how to find without being asked. Multiple casualties, trauma status, en route. She went back to her cart and continued her medication round. The call came over the hospital-wide system at 6:28. Mass casualty alert. All available trauma staff report to the ER. Mass casualty alert. Claire heard the announcement ripple through the 3rd floor. The sound of nurses pausing, the crack of the PA going quiet. Then the building beginning to shift like an organism that had received an alert signal and was rerouting resources to the threat. Footsteps on the stairs. The elevator chiming. Voices dropping into the focused register of people switching modes. She kept moving her cart. She was, officially, 3rd floor med-surg. She was not cleared for trauma rotation. She had been explicitly told by both Dr. Harwick and Dolores Vane that the trauma bay was not her territory. She kept moving her cart. Harold Pruitt stuck his head out of room 320. "What's going on?" "Mass casualty protocol," she said. "Stay in your room, please. It's precautionary." "Something big?" "I don't know yet." She did know. Or she knew enough. The burst transmission she'd heard had given her the shape of it even without the full picture, and the sound of those helicopters, because now she could hear them, two at minimum from the rotor overlap, a third possibly, confirmed what the transmission had suggested. This was not a car accident. This was not a ski hill incident. The approach angle, the speed, the formation she could read from the sound alone. She finished her medication round. She noted everything in the chart. She made sure Harold Pruitt's door was fully closed. Then she walked to the elevator. She was not going to the trauma bay. She was going downstairs because the hospital was in mass casualty protocol, and every set of trained hands might matter, and she was a trained set of hands. She had a reason to be in the building. She had an obligation to respond. She told herself both of these things in the elevator, watching the numbers descend. She did not tell herself the other thing, the thing underneath those reasons, the thing that had moved in her body the moment she'd heard those rotors. A recognition so deep it sat below thought, below language, in the place where the training and the years and the losses had all compressed into something that she no longer knew how to call by name. The elevator opened on the ground floor. The ER was already controlled chaos. Controlled because the staff here were good at their jobs. Because Vantage Point had a solid emergency department with capable nurses and 2 senior attendings and a competent trauma team that had handled bad ski accidents and industrial injuries and the occasional genuine emergency with professional efficiency. Chaos. Because what was coming through the ambulance bay entrance was not something this hospital had been built for. Claire saw the first stretcher come through the doors, and her body did what it did, parsing the scene in the automatic visual inventory that she had once been trained to execute in seconds and had never stopped doing. Male, mid-30s, full tactical kit being cut away by the paramedics, penetrating wound left thorax, tension pneumothorax risk based on the reduced chest wall movement, BP already dropping from the gray cast to the face, and the irregular venous distension at the neck. She was moving before she finished the assessment. "Hey!" A hand on her arm. Not aggressive, but firm. She turned and found Dr. Harwick in full trauma gear, surgical cap already on, hands up in the blocking posture of a man who had made a decision about traffic flow. MedSurg doesn't respond to mass casualty unless paged specifically. "Where's your floor supervisor?" "Upstairs." "Then you should be upstairs." "There are more coming," Claire said. "I heard the rotors, at least 3 aircraft." Harwick's expression shifted, not softening, but recalibrating, the way a man recalibrated when he was annoyed but needed information. "How many patients?" "I don't know the number, but the load pattern from that approach." She stopped, caught herself. "My read of the incoming volume is that you're going to be short-staffed in about 4 minutes. We have protocols for that. We page the floors." "Yes, sir." He studied her for 2 seconds. "Go to intake. You can help with triage documentation." It was an assignment designed to keep her out of the way while appearing to use her. Claire knew this and accepted it and moved to the intake desk and picked up a tablet and began logging, because documentation during mass casualty was not nothing. It was actually critically important, the kind of thing that got missed when everyone was focused on the acute interventions and then became a problem at 2 in the morning when a dose was duplicated or a blood type was wrong in the system. She was logging and watching. The second stretcher came through. Another operator, younger, shoulder wound that was messy but probably manageable, conscious and gripping the side rail of the stretcher with the white-knuckle-controlled grip of someone who had been trained to endure. Third stretcher. More serious, abdominal involvement. She could see that from across the room. Fourth. The fourth stretcher stopped just inside the entrance. The man on it was not unconscious. I was suspended in that particular state of severe injury where the body had narrowed everything down to the essential, heart rate, breath, the management of pain into something workable. And the eyes were doing the only thing they could do, which was observe. He was large, even lying down, broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical architecture that spoke to years of specific conditioning. His kit had been partially removed. There was blood on his neck and jaw that was not his primary wound site, but had come from somewhere else. The spatter pattern suggesting proximity to something that had gone badly. He was scanning the room, not panicking, cataloging. His eyes moved the way people's eyes moved when they had been trained to move that way, taking inventory of exits, personnel, threat vectors. Even here, even like this. His eyes reached Claire. They stopped. She felt it. The specific quality of being recognized by someone who knew you from a context that no longer existed, the way a sound from the past could reach across years and find the exact nerve it had always been connected to. His mouth moved. His voice was wrecked from whatever he'd inhaled at the incident site, rough and barely audible across the noise of the ER. Widow? The word landed in the room and spread outward from its point of impact. It was not a name anyone in that building had ever heard used for Claire Donovan, the quiet third-floor med-surg nurse who kept her head down and requested early shifts and never talked about what she'd done before. It was a name from a different taxonomy entirely, the kind of name that got assigned rather than chosen, earned in circumstances that were not discussed in polite company or professional settings, a call sign that a person carried out of a life they'd left and was not supposed to follow them into whatever came next. It followed her anyway. The room didn't exactly freeze because in a mass casualty event, rooms don't freeze. The IVs keep running and the monitors keep alarming and the work doesn't stop. But there was a shift, a quality of attention shift, the kind that happened when something unexpected landed in a space where everyone thought they knew all the variables. Dr. Harwick turned from the first stretcher. Two of the operators on the other stretchers, the shoulder wound, the young one still gripping the rail, had heard it too. Something moved through them simultaneously, a recognition that passed between them without words, the way recognition passed between people who had shared the specific grammar of certain experiences. The man on the fourth stretcher lifted his chin slightly. It cost him something to do it. His eyes didn't leave Claire. Claire set down the tablet. "Oh, negative," she said, not loudly, but in the carrying voice that cut through ambient noise without requiring volume. The voice that had once been used in different conditions than fluorescent hospital lighting and the smell of antiseptic. "Who's managing his airway?" No one answered. The paramedics who had brought him in were already moving to the next incoming. "His trachea is deviated," she said, crossing the room. "Left main bronchus compromised, possible hemothorax. Who has the chest kit?" "Donovan," Harwick's voice sharp. "Stand down." "You are not." The operator on the first stretcher, the one Harwick had been working on, reached out and caught the surgeon's wrist. Not hard, but with the specific authority of someone who had never learned to be tentative about physical communication. "Let her work," the operator said. Harwick looked down at the hand on his wrist with the expression of a man who had not been physically interrupted in a very long time. "Sir, this is my trauma bay and this nurse is not—" "Let her work." The operator on the rail, the shoulder wound, the young one, had pushed himself to a sitting position that he had no business attempting. "Doc," he said, and his voice was steadier than it had any right to be given what his shoulder looked like. "Whatever she tells you, do it. We're not arguing with Widow." Claire did not look at any of them. She had the chest assessment kit in her hands from the crash cart that she had noted the position of when she walked in, that she had been tracking since the first stretcher arrived without consciously deciding to track it, because she had long ago stopped being able to decide not to notice certain things. "I need a 14-gauge needle," she said. "Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, now." The ER nurse closest to her, a woman named Patricia, who had always been vaguely pleasant to Claire in the hall, in the way that people were pleasant to someone they didn't particularly think about, stared at her for one beat. Then she reached for the supply cart and found the needle and handed it over. "Thank you," Claire said. She was already moving. Behind her she heard Harwick's voice, stripped of its usual authority, flattened into something that was not quite surrender, but was the terrain immediately adjacent to it. "Someone get me her credentials file," he said. Nobody moved to comply immediately, because they were all doing other things, managing the 4 patients already inside and preparing for the 5th and 6th that she could hear coming through the ambulance bay entrance right now, the sound of wheels on the ramp and voices calling ahead, the whole controlled catastrophic machinery of mass casualty response running at full speed. Claire settled her hands. She had done this before, in conditions that made this room look comfortable. She had done this in the dark, on the ground, with the sound of things happening nearby that were worse than any sound in this building. She had done it with her hands shaking from cold and from fear and from grief once. And she had done it right anyway. And she had not thought about that until right now, standing in the fluorescent light with the correct equipment and the full support structure of a modern trauma center available to her. She thought about it for exactly 1 second. Then she let the thought go and found the landmark by feel and did what needed to be done. The man on the stretcher exhaled. The specific sound of pressure releasing from where it had no right to be. The quality of a crisis interrupted mid-development by the correct intervention at the correct moment. "There you go," she said quietly. He reached up and put his hand briefly over hers where it rested on his chest. Just for a second, not speaking, not needing to. Through the still-open ambulance bay doors, the next helicopter was banking in over the ridgeline, and from outside came the hard-edged sound of rotor wash and shouted coordination, and the ER team was already repositioning to receive the next wave. And Harwick was standing 6 feet away looking at Claire Donovan with the expression of a man who had just learned something that rearranged every assumption he'd been operating on. And she could hear more stretchers coming, more voices, more of the weight of it, arriving all at once. And somewhere beneath the noise and the motion and the fluorescent certainty of the room, one of the operators on the far stretcher, the young one with the shoulder wound who should not have been sitting up, looked at his teammate and said something too quiet for most people to catch. But Claire caught it. "Told you," he said. "Widow doesn't miss." She moved to the next patient. She moved to the next patient and the next after that. And for the following 40 minutes, the trauma bay operated in a way it had never quite operated before. Not because everything went smoothly, because it did not, because nothing in mass casualty ever did, but because there was now a center of gravity in the room that hadn't existed when the first helicopter arrived. A point around which the controlled chaos organized itself, whether the people in the room had consciously chosen that or not. The fifth patient came through the doors, presenting with a GSW to the right thigh that had been field dressed by someone who knew what they were doing. The tourniquet placement was correct, the pressure dressing tight. The notation on the field tag accurate enough that Claire could read it at a glance and immediately know what had already been done and what still needed doing. She checked the femoral pulse distal to the wound, confirmed it was present but weakened, flagged the patient for vascular surgery consult, and moved. The sixth patient was unconscious, and this was the one that made Patricia, the ER nurse who had handed Claire the needle 20 minutes ago, stop and look at her with something that wasn't quite fear, but was in the same family. "His pressure is in the basement," Patricia said. 60/40. We've had 2 liters in already." "When did he lose consciousness?" 12 minutes ago, roughly. He was talking on the way in." "Talking about what?" Patricia blinked. He was talking. I don't know what specifically." "It matters," Claire said, not harshly but quickly, running her hands over the patient's abdomen with the focused, deliberate pressure of someone mapping terrain. "Was he coherent? Was he confused? Was he agitated?" "Confused, I think. Kept asking about..." Patricia checked the field notes. "Someone named Reyes. His teammate." "Okay." Claire's hands stopped at the left upper quadrant. She pressed. The patient's body responded even in unconsciousness, a subtle guarding that wasn't visible to someone who wasn't looking for it, a tensing of musculature around a pain source. "Get me the ultrasound. Fast exam." "Dr. Harwick is still with patient 1. I know. Get me the ultrasound." Patricia got the ultrasound. Claire did the exam in 90 seconds, the probe moving through the 4 standard views, and what she found in the left upper quadrant confirmed what her hands had already told her. Free fluid, splenic involvement, a source of hemorrhage that the external assessment had not caught because there was no external wound, because whatever had happened at the incident site had generated the kind of blunt force trauma that left no entry point to find. She straightened up and raised her voice to a level that crossed the noise of the room without competing with it. "I need Dr. Harwick on patient 6, suspected splenic laceration with free fluid. He needs the OR in the next 15 minutes, or his pressure is going to hit a floor we can't bring him back from." Across the room, Harwick looked up. Their eyes met. He was still wearing the expression he'd had since she performed the needle decompression on the 4th patient. The expression of a man who had been handed information that fundamentally contradicted a framework he'd been operating inside, and who had not yet decided what to do with the contradiction. There was something in it that might have been anger, or might have been a specific variety of professional humiliation that looks like anger from the outside, or might have been something more complicated than either. He crossed to patient 6 without comment. He ran his own hands over the abdomen. He looked at the ultrasound image on the screen. He looked at the numbers on the monitor. Then he looked at Claire. "Or 2, he said. "I'll scrub." "Yes, sir." He moved toward the scrub room and didn't look back at her, and Claire turned away from that interaction as soon as it was finished, because she didn't have time to sit inside it, and she didn't want to anyway. What she wanted, what she needed, was to find the thing she'd been tracking in her peripheral awareness for the last several minutes, while simultaneously managing patients 5 and 6. The thing that had been nagging at her with the low-frequency insistence of a problem that hadn't declared itself yet. It was patient 3. The abdominal injury. She had flagged him, assessed him, handed him to the trauma team and moved on because that had been the right call at the time. He was packaged. He was moving toward intervention. The more immediate crises had required her attention. But something in the pattern she'd observed in those first 30 seconds was still running in the back of her mind, a loose thread that she hadn't had time to pull. She found him in Bay 3, where the team had him on a monitor with 2 large-bore IVs running wide open and a surgical consult paged. His pressure was holding, 94/60, not good, but not critical. His belly was rigid. The surgical resident who had been assigned to him was a young man named Dr. Fowler, who Claire had seen occasionally in the halls, and who seemed competent in the specific, careful way of someone who had learned enough to know what he didn't know. "How long since the trauma?" Claire asked, pulling up the field notes. Fowler checked his tablet. "Estimated 45 minutes from incident to arrival here." "Any response to the fluid resuscitation?" "Pressure came up from 68 to 94. "Then came back down?" Fowler looked at the trend. "How did you know that?" "It's on the monitor graph, see that?" She pointed. The blood pressure trace on the monitor showed the classic biphasic pattern, an initial response to volume, followed by a plateau and a subtle creeping descent that had started in the last 8 minutes. He responded and then stopped responding. That means the source is still active. What's his heart rate trend? Climbing. Started at 110, now 120. Mechanism of injury? Blast plus blunt trauma. He was thrown. Claire looked at the patient. He was a large man, one of the larger operators she'd seen come through, which meant he was carrying more physiologic reserve than a smaller person, which meant the numbers would stay deceptively reassuring longer than they would for someone else, and when they stopped being deceptive, they would stop fast. She pulled the ultrasound back over. The free fluid she'd seen on initial assessment was unchanged. She'd expected that. She moved to the pelvis, which she had not had time to image on the initial pass. The view opened on the screen and she looked at it for 3 seconds. "Call the OR," she said. "Now." "We have a surgical consult pending up. Cancel the consult and call the OR. He has pelvic free fluid that was not on the initial assessment. The bleeding source has shifted." She looked at Fowler directly. "If you wait for the consult, you're going to have an intraoperative code instead of a surgery. Page Dr. Harwick." "Dr. Harwick is already in the OR with..." "Then page whoever's next on the trauma call list, but move. Right now." Fowler paged. She stayed with patient 3 until the surgical team materialized at the bay entrance 3 minutes later, gave them the handoff in the compressed, efficient format she had learned in conditions where a longer format meant someone died, and stepped back. Her hands were steady. They had been steady throughout. This was not a point of pride so much as a fact about how she was built, or how she had been built, over years and repetition, and the gradual process of pressure teaching the body what it could contain. She remembered a time when they hadn't been. She remembered standing in a corridor very different from this one, looking at her own hands after losing a patient, and finding in them a tremor that had nothing to do with cold. She did not spend time on that memory. She pushed it flat and moved on. The 7th and 8th patients arrived together, brought in a ground transport that had staged at the landing zone, while the helicopters evacuated the priority cases. They were walking wounded, a phrase that always slightly misrepresented the actual condition, because walking wounded rarely looked like they were walking voluntarily, more like they were being conducted forward by some residual autonomic command that had not yet received the message about how serious things were. The first one, a compact man with a crew cut grown out to the point of mild military non-compliance, had a laceration across his left forearm that had been field bandaged with the kind of creative improvisation that happened when standard medical supplies ran out. She could see the edge of what appeared to be a cut-up undershirt under the pressure wrap. His shoulder had a separate issue that he was managing by holding the arm in a particular position, locked close to his body. The kind of angle that someone landed on after being thrown and then decided to maintain because it hurt less. The second man was using the first as a crutch and trying not to make this obvious. He had taped his own ankle at some point, the tape visible above the boot he had not taken off, probably correctly concluding that the boot was serving as structural support and removing it would make things worse. Claire assessed both of them in the time it took to reach them, which was approximately 4 seconds. "Forearm lack in a shoulder," she said to the first man. "Which shoulder?" "Left," he said. "AC joint, probably. I've had it before." "What year?" "Which time?" "Fair enough." She moved to the second man. "Ankle. Did you tape that yourself?" "Medic at the staging area." "Your medic or theirs?" "Ours." He said it with a slight emphasis that she decoded immediately. Their own team's medic, someone they trusted, not a stranger. "Good tape job," she said, meaning it. "We're going to get imaging on that before we take the boot off. If it's what I think it is, the boot is the only thing holding the mortise together." The man looked at her. He was younger than most of the others, early 20s, with the kind of face that still showed things it would probably learn to stop showing in another few years. What it was showing right now was something between surprise and a specific kind of relief. The relief of someone who had been bracing for a conversation they'd have to manage and found instead someone who already spoke the language. "You know fractures," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know a few things," Claire said. "Reyes," he said. "My name. Corman, second class. I know some things too." She looked at him. At the face that was still too young for what it had already been through, at the taped ankle and the careful posture he was holding to manage whatever else hurt that he wasn't mentioning, at the way he'd said his name with the reflex formality of someone who had been trained to identify themselves in contact situations. "Reyes," she repeated. She noted it, cataloged it against what Patricia had told her about the unconscious patient in Bay 3 asking for someone named Reyes, and filed the information. She would tell him when the time was right. This was not the time. "Sit down before you fall down." He sat. The room had found a kind of rhythm by then. Not calm. Mass casualty never reached calm while the patients were still arriving and the ORs were still filling and the blood bank was running numbers, and every monitor in the department seemed to be generating a different alert at a slightly different pitch. But rhythm, which was different from calm, which was the working beat of a system that had absorbed the shock of the initial load and was now processing it with the disciplined machinery of trained people doing what trained people did. Claire was moving through that rhythm when she became aware of a new presence in the room. Not a patient, not hospital staff. A man who had come in through the ambulance bay entrance without using a stretcher and without being stopped by anyone, partly because he moved with the kind of purposeful authority that caused people to assume he belonged wherever he was going, and partly because the security protocols at Vantage Point were not designed for a scenario in which military personnel arrived without formal coordination. He was in his mid-50s, she estimated, with the physical bearing of someone who had operated in field conditions long enough that the bearing had become permanent, built into the structure of how he held himself at rest. He was wearing civilian clothes, dark pants, a jacket that fit in a way that suggested it had been chosen to conceal the thing it was concealing. And he was scanning the room with the same automatic inventory she had observed in several of the patients, except with the added layer of someone who was not injured and whose full attention was available for the task. He found her in approximately 6 seconds. He crossed the room in 12. "Donovan," he said. Not a question, not a greeting, a confirmation. She looked at him. She felt the recognition moving through her in a specific register. Not the shock recognition of the operator on the 4th stretcher seeing her for the first time in years, but something older, more complicated, a recognition layered with history that she had not reviewed in a long time and had not fully expected to ever review. "Commander Voss," she said. He was no longer a commander. She could see that from the civilian clothes and the absence of insignia, and from the particular way he held the rank she'd given him, not correcting it but not claiming it either, the way people held past identities when those identities were complicated. "You need to talk to me," he said, "when this settles." "I'm working." "I know. I've been watching you work for the last 8 minutes. He paused. Splenic lac on patient 6 was the right call. The pelvic bleed on 3 was sharper. I had time on 3. You had 40 seconds on 3. She didn't respond to that. She looked at the room, at the patients, at the status board that Patricia was updating with the focused attention of someone trying to create order through information. How many total? Claire asked. 9 on the primary list. 2 more were medevac to Denver. We lost 1 at the site. He said the last sentence in the flat register of someone who had learned to deliver that information without affect, which meant nothing about whether it affected him. Who? Petty Officer Lamb, 23 years old. Claire held that for 1 second. Put it where she put things like that, in the place that was already full of them, the place she didn't open. 'Cause of incident? Under investigation. I'm not discussing that here. He glanced around the room, taking in the hospital staff, the proximity of people who were not cleared for whatever he wasn't saying. Donovan, we need to talk. You said that. What happened today? These men trust you. Several of them are asking for you specifically. I need to understand your current status here before I involve the hospital administration. She turned to look at him directly. My current status is that I'm a nurse on the 3rd floor med-surg ward who is currently responding to a mass casualty event. That's my status. Something moved across Voss's face. Not quite amusement, something that had amusement as a more distant relative. I've read your file, Donovan, the complete one. There's only 1 file. There are 2 files. You know there are 2 files. He held her gaze. The one you submitted when you applied here says you were a civilian emergency medical technician for 3 years after leaving the service. It lists your certifications. It doesn't list anything else. I listed what was relevant. The second file lists other things. That file is classified. Yes, he agreed. It is. They looked at each other across 2 years and 11 months of distance that Claire had constructed very carefully, stone by stone, the careful architecture of a life that had been designed specifically to not be this conversation. There are things happening, Voss said, that you need to know about why these men were at that training site, about what went wrong. He stopped. His jaw moved slightly, the particular tension of someone choosing words with precision. And about Sergeant Aldrich. The name arrived in Claire's chest like a physical impact. She kept her face still. She had learned to do this. It cost something to do it when the impact was this size, but she had learned. That's not, she started. Claire. He used her first name, which he had almost never done, which told her something about how serious this was. He's alive. The room continued around her. The monitors, the voices, the ongoing machinery of the mass casualty response that she was supposed to be part of, that she had been part of, that she needed to get back to. She was aware of all of it at a physical level, the way you were aware of the ground under your feet, even when you weren't thinking about it. That's not possible, she said. Her voice came out level. She was slightly surprised by this. It's documented. There's a reason I'm here today that has nothing to do with the training accident, though the timing became... He stopped again. This is not the place. No, she said. It isn't. Trauma Bay. Dr. Harwick's voice coming from behind her, louder than necessary, carrying the particular loaded quality of a man who had exited a surgery to find his trauma department rearranged around an authority he hadn't authorized. What is going on? Who are you? This aimed at Voss. And why are there people in this department who don't belong here? Voss turned to look at Harwick with the unhurried assessment of someone who had evaluated more threatening things than an angry surgeon and found him somewhere in the lower range of concerns. My name is Theodore Voss, he said. I'm here as an official liaison for Naval Special Warfare Command. These are my men. He said it with the simple ownership of a man stating a fact about furniture. I have some questions about the care they're receiving. Harwick's color changed. Any questions about patient care go through the hospital administration in my office. Not directly to... That's fine, Voss said agreeably. I'll involve administration. I was hoping to handle this more efficiently, but if that's your preference. My preference, Harwick said, his voice dropping into the register he used when he wanted to establish that this was his ground, and he knew it better than anyone else, is that we maintain the chain of authority in my department. That means medical staff respond to medical direction, not to... He gestured in the general direction of Claire. Whatever this is. Whatever this is, Voss repeated. She is a floor nurse. She is not credentialed for trauma interventions. She is not on the trauma team. The actions she took today saved 3 of my men, Voss said. Possibly 4, depending on how patient 3 comes out of the OR. That is not the point. What is the point, Dr. Harwick? The question landed in the room and sat there, clean and simple and somehow more pointed than it appeared. Harwick opened his mouth and then closed it, reassembling something. The staff who were close enough to hear had found reasons to be busy nearby. The studied busyness of people who didn't want to be seen watching, but were watching. The point, Harwick said finally, is that this hospital has protocols. Those protocols exist for patient safety, and when someone, he turned to Claire, disregards those protocols because she's decided she knows better, it creates liability, it creates confusion in the care team, and it is a fireable offense. Claire looked at him. She had known something like this was coming. The specific shape of it was slightly different than she'd anticipated. She had expected it to come later, after the immediate crisis was contained, not in the middle of the bay with patients still actively in treatment. But the substance of it was exactly what she'd expected. "Yes, sir," she said. "I'm formally documenting this. You're being removed from the floor pending review." "I understand." "That's it? You understand?" "Yes, sir." Harwick stared at her. The simple acceptance seemed to confuse him, the way simple acceptance often confused people who were expecting resistance, because resistance was what they had prepared for, and accommodation disrupted the script. "Voss," Claire said without looking away from Harwick, "will you excuse us for a moment?" Voss looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully decode, something between respect and concern, the blend of emotions she associated with people who knew enough about her history to have both. He stepped back. "Dr. Harwick," Claire said, and her voice was still level, still quiet, still the same register she'd been using all morning. "I understand that I violated protocol. I'm not going to argue that. You can document it, and I'll accept whatever the review determines." "Good. But I need to tell you one thing before you write the report." Harwick waited. "Patient 3, she said. Room bay 3. The pelvic hemorrhage I flagged 15 minutes ago. Did Dr. Pendleton get him to the OR?" Harwick's expression shifted fractionally. "He's in OR 3 now. The field assessment at intake described only abdominal involvement. If I had stayed at intake and done documentation as you assigned me, the pelvic source would not have been imaged until the surgical team opened and found it. At that point, his pressure would have been—" She stopped. "Write whatever you need to write. I'll sign the acknowledgement." She looked at him for one more second. "That's what I needed to say." She picked up the tablet from where she had set it down when she crossed the room to Bay 3, and she went back to documentation, which was what she had been assigned, which was what she was doing when the first helicopter arrived, which was where she would stay until someone told her to leave, or the situation changed. Harwick stood in the center of the bay for 4 seconds without moving. Then he turned and went back toward the scrub room. What? Reyes had not stayed where she'd put him. She found this out when she looked up from the documentation tablet approximately 20 minutes after the Harwick confrontation and processed the changed geography of the room. The chair where she had seated him was empty. The first man, the forearm laceration, the shoulder, was still in his bay and had acquired an orthopedic consult who was examining the shoulder with the particular wince-inducing thoroughness of someone confirming what the patient had already correctly self-diagnosed. But Reyes was gone. She found him in the corridor outside Bay 3. He was standing against the wall at the exact angle that minimized weight-bearing on the taped ankle, and he was looking through the narrow window in the OR 3 door with the fixed attention of someone who had nothing else to do with his attention because everything that mattered to him was on the other side of that glass. "You should be sitting down," Claire said. "Yeah," he agreed without moving. She stood beside him. She could see through the window, the surgical team around the table, the organized choreography of an open abdominal case in progress, the attending's hands moving in the particular focused way that told you things were difficult but controlled. "He's going to be okay," she said. "You don't know that." "No," she agreed. "I don't know that. But his pressure was responding when they took him in, the source was identified early, and they have a good surgical team." Reyes was quiet for a moment. Outside the narrow window, the surgery continued. "He took the blast trying to cover me," Reyes said. "I was in the wrong position. It was a training exercise, and I was in the wrong position because I was—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. You don't have to tell me. I know. He continued to look through the window. He pushed me clear. That's why the blast trauma is interior instead of... It doesn't matter. He pushed me clear. Claire watched the surgery through the window. That's what people do for each other. He has a daughter, 4 years old. She just started... He stopped again. She didn't say anything. She had learned over time that there was a specific kind of grief that needed silence more than it needed response, and that talking into it was a form of interruption, even when it was well-intentioned. After a moment, Reyes said, "Who's Aldrich?" She went still. I wasn't... He made a small gesture. I wasn't listening. I was here when Voss was talking to you. The wall doesn't... He glanced at her. Sorry, I shouldn't have said anything. No, she said. Was he one of yours? The question was precise in the way that people who worked in particular contexts were precise. One of yours meaning not one of mine, meaning on your team, meaning someone you carried responsibility for in the specific way that you carried responsibility for people whose lives had overlapped with yours in the conditions that produced this kind of conversation. She stood at the window for a long time without answering. From behind them, down the corridor, she heard Voss's voice, and another voice she didn't immediately recognize, and the particular quality of a conversation that had escalated past the point where the people having it were pretending to be calm. She turned. Voss was in the hallway outside the ER entrance, and with him was a man in a military uniform. Not tactical gear, but formal service dress, the kind that meant administrative authority rather than operational presence. And between the two of them was a third figure, a woman Claire had never seen before, slight, with close cropped dark hair and the kind of posture that said civilian authority rather than military, a tablet computer held against her chest like a document she was prepared to produce at short notice. All three of them were looking toward the ER. All three of them, she realized a half-second later, were looking at her. The woman with the tablet raised it slightly and said something to Voss that Claire couldn't hear through the glass of the corridor door. Voss's face changed. Not collapsed. Voss was not a man whose face collapsed. But something in it shifted toward a gravity that she associated from long experience with situations that were about to become significantly more complicated than they already were. He pushed open the corridor door and walked directly to her, and the uniformed man and the civilian woman followed him, and Claire felt in her chest the particular sensation of an event reaching a point of no return, the way certain events did, the way the morning had been reaching it incrementally since the first rotor sound over the ridge, the way she had probably known since she woke up that morning, or some part of her had known, the part that tracked certain things without being asked. Donovan, Voss said. He stopped in front of her. This is Captain Renata Osgood, JAG Corps. And this, he indicated the civilian woman, is Dr. Felicia Marsh. She's with the DoD Inspector General's office. Claire looked at both of them in turn. Ms. Donovan, Dr. Marsh said, and her voice had the precise measured quality of someone who spent her professional life in rooms where words had legal weight. We've been looking for you for some time. Claire looked at Voss. He met her eyes, and for the first time in the conversation she saw in his face the thing that he'd been managing out of his expression since he arrived. Not quite apology, but something in the territory of it. The specific expression of a man who had known something was coming and had not been able to stop it, and was now watching it arrive. Looking for me, Claire said. Why? Dr. Marsh opened the tablet and turned it so the screen faced Claire. On the screen was a document, a military record, a name at the top that Claire had not seen in official form in 3 years, that she had worked very deliberately to keep from being connected to the woman she had become here in Creston Falls. Her name, her real record, the full one. And below it, in the dense bureaucratic language of official military documentation, the details of an incident that had been the last thing she carried out of that life, the incident she had blamed herself for, that she had built her exit around, that had shaped every quiet shift and every requested early rotation and every deliberate act of invisibility for the past 3 years. There's been a review, Dr. Marsh said, a formal review of the incident record from November 3 years ago. Claire could not feel her hands. She was aware of this in a distant way, the way you became aware of distant physical facts when other things were demanding more immediate attention. The review found, Dr. Marsh continued, that the findings of the original board were incorrect. The corridor was very quiet. Reyes had not moved from the wall. Voss was watching her with the expression of a man watching something he had not been able to prevent and was not certain she would survive, in the specific emotional sense of survive. Incorrect, Claire repeated. In significant ways, Dr. Marsh said. Ms. Donovan, the record that was filed about you and about that incident. She stopped, selected her next words. There are people who have a great deal to answer for, including people who are still operating in positions of authority. She glanced at Voss. He gave her a slight nod that seemed to convey permission. Including people connected to what happened at the training site today. The sound from the OR behind her, the distant rhythmic sounds of a surgery in progress, the slight vibration of equipment through the door, a world contained and separate from this corridor, continued without comment on any of this. Sergeant Aldrich, Claire said. Dr. Marsh looked at the tablet. He was a witness to the original incident. His testimony was suppressed. She met Claire's eyes. He's been trying to surface it through proper channels for 2 years. He was blocked at every level. She paused. He went outside proper channels approximately 6 weeks ago. That created, she chose the word carefully, movement. Claire's hands were still not registering fully. She pressed them flat against the sides of her scrub pants, feeling the fabric, anchoring herself to the physical. Where is he? She asked. Nobody answered immediately. In the space of that silence, the door to OR3 opened, and Dr. Pendleton emerged in his surgical gown with his mask pulled down, and he walked directly to Reyes, and whatever he said to the young corpsman was said too quietly for the group in the corridor to hear, but it made Reyes close his eyes and press the back of his head against the wall, and exhale in a way that answered the question Claire had not been able to answer for him. She watched this from the corridor, then she turned back to Voss and Dr. Marsh and Captain Osgood, and she looked at them with the focused clarity of someone who had just been handed more information than she could fully process, and was choosing to process exactly as much of it as the next few minutes required. Where is Aldrich? She asked again. Voss and Dr. Marsh exchanged a look. That, Voss said, is the complicated part. That, Voss said, is the complicated part. He did not elaborate immediately, and the pause was not the pause of someone organizing thoughts, but the pause of someone who had already organized them and was deciding how much of the organization to share. Claire had seen this particular pause before, in briefings and debriefs and the conversations that happened in the spaces between official processes, and she had learned to read the quality of it. This one carried the specific weight of information that had more than one edge. He's in Colorado, Voss said finally. That's not complicated. That's a location. He's in Creston Falls. She looked at him. He's been in Creston Falls for 11 days, Voss said. He came here because he knew you were here. He was trying to reach you through channels that wouldn't create a record, which is, as it turns out, more difficult than it sounds when someone has been flagged at the clearance level he's been flagged at. Who flagged him? Dr. Marsh answered that. The investigation is ongoing. What we know is that his original testimony was suppressed at the command level. We know there was deliberate obstruction of his attempts to surface the record. And we know that the obstruction was connected to at least 2 individuals who are currently involved in the administration of the training program that generated today's incident. Names, Claire said. Not yet, Dr. Marsh said. We need the full evidentiary picture before names become part of any document. That's process. People died today because of process. The word landed in the corridor with its full weight. Dr. Marsh absorbed it without flinching, which told Claire something about her, that she had been in enough of these conversations to know that absorbing that particular weight was part of the job and not something to deflect or argue with. Yes, Dr. Marsh said simply. They did. Voss pulled out his phone and found something on it and turned the screen toward Claire. It was a text message, 3 days old, sent from an unregistered number, trying to reach CD. It's M. Tell her the record doesn't match the truth. Tell her I was there and I'm talking. M. Marcus Aldrich had gone by Mark to everyone who knew him in any context except official paperwork. The only people who would have known to use the initial M rather than spelling it out were people who had known him well enough to know how he used his own name. She stared at the screen for a beat longer than necessary. Where is he right now? She asked. That's the problem, Voss said. He was at a motel on Route 9 as of 3 days ago. Captain Osgood's team attempted contact yesterday morning. He wasn't there. His things were still in the room. He wasn't there. The silence that followed that information was a different quality from the earlier silences. Claire processed it with the specific part of her mind that she had been trying to leave dormant for 3 years. The part that did not traffic in assumptions or worst-case scenarios as emotional responses but ran them as practical assessments, calculating probability and response options simultaneously. "How many people knew he was here?" she asked. Voss and Dr. Marsh exchanged the look again. This time it was Captain Osgood who answered, and her voice was the voice of someone delivering information they wished they did not have to deliver. "As of 72 hours ago, officially, only the three of us and two analysts at the IG's office." She paused. "Unofficially, we don't know. The leak question is part of the investigation. So there may be people who knew he was in Creston Falls who had a reason to not want him talking to you." "Yes," Osgood said. "And those people are connected to what happened at the training site today." "Potentially." Claire looked at the three of them. Voss with his civilian jacket and his complicated expression, Marsh with her tablet and her careful language, Osgood in formal service dress, with the specific posture of someone who had just confirmed something they'd been hoping to keep theoretical. She looked at Reyes, still against the wall, who had heard all of this with the quiet attentiveness of someone who was not pretending to be out of earshot and was not going to pretend otherwise. She looked through the window in the OR door at the surgery that was now in its final stages, the patient on the table who had been 20 minutes from a crisis she had caught, because she had pressed his abdomen and listened to what her hands told her. "I have patients," she said. "Donovan, I have patients who still need me. When the acute situation is stable, I'll talk to you, all of you. But right now," she looked at Voss, "find out if there's any record of Aldrich using a vehicle while he was at the motel. And check the hospital admit records for the last 3 days." She paused. "If someone knew he was trying to reach me and he's been missing for a day, I'd start by checking whether he was hurt before he was missing." She left them in the corridor and went back to work. The next 2 hours ran at a different speed than the first 40 minutes. Not slower exactly, but less compressed. The difference between the initial impact of a mass casualty event and the sustained management of it. The helicopter patients were distributed across the ORs and ICU and 2 trauma bays, each one of them generating their own stream of decisions and documentation and coordination. And Claire moved through this with the focus of someone who had learned to operate in sustained high-demand conditions without burning through reserves she couldn't afford to burn. Reyes went for imaging on the ankle and came back with a confirmed syndesmotic disruption that was going to need surgical fixation, which he received with the expression of someone receiving information that was significantly less bad than what they had been bracing for. The operator with the shoulder, his name was Terrence Coble, she got this from the intake documentation, turned out to have a grade 3 AC separation that the orthopedic attending managed with a shoulder immobilizer and a conversation about the difference between treatable and catastrophic, after which Coble looked at the ceiling for a while in the particular way of someone reordering their assessment of a day that had already had a lot of reordering in it. The fourth patient, the one who had recognized her, who had said her name, whose name she'd been carefully not saying in her own internal narration, because names added weight, and she was managing weight carefully, was out of his procedure and in a recovery bay, and as of the last check, stable. His name was Chief Petty Officer Darnell Wakefield, and she had worked with him on 2 separate deployments 8 years ago, during which he had been reliably competent and occasionally infuriating in the way that people you respected were sometimes infuriating, and seeing him on that stretcher with blood on his jaw had cost her something she had not been able to fully account in the moment. She went to Recovery Bay 4. He was awake, post-anesthesia, the particular washed-out wakefulness of someone whose body was starting to take stock of what it had been through. His eyes tracked to her when she came in, and he watched her do the assessment, vitals, drain output, breath sounds, with the patient monitoring of someone who knew what she was checking and why and wasn't going to rush her. "Hey," he said when she'd finished. "Hey, you look exactly the same," he said. "You look like you got blown up." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "Procedure go okay?" "Textbook. You're going to be sore for a while, but you'll get there." "The others?" "I'll let you know when I have a full picture." She adjusted the drainage tubing, which didn't need adjusting but gave her hand something to do. "How did you know I was here?" "Didn't," he said. "Not until I saw you across the room." He paused. "When I said your name, I wasn't sure I wasn't hallucinating. I was pretty far gone by then. You weren't hallucinating. No. He looked at her with the direct assessment of someone who had known her in a different context and was now doing the calculation of how much of that context remained. Widow in a hospital in Colorado, he said. Never would have called that. People change careers. You're not a nurse, Donovan. I am, she said. I've been a nurse for 3 years. I have the license and the rotation schedule to prove it. You know what I mean? She did know what he meant. She also knew that the person she had been when he'd known her and the person she was now were more continuous than she usually allowed herself to consider, and that what had happened in the trauma bay this morning had made the distance she had built between those two versions of herself significantly harder to maintain. Rest, she said. I'll come back. Donovan. His voice stopped her at the curtain. Whatever's going on, Voss being here, the JAG officer, whatever this is, you should know that there are people who've been waiting a long time for someone to look at that record. She held the curtain without turning. That's not, she started. I know you, he said. I know you think what happened was on you. I know you've been carrying that. I'm telling you. People who were there, people who know the full picture. We don't see it the way you see it. She let go of the curtain. She walked back to the nurse's station and picked up the next chart. It was Dr. Harwick who introduced the next complication, because the day had apparently decided that the mass casualty event and the appearance of Voss and the news about Aldrich and the conversation with Wakefield were not sufficient load for a single morning, and something additional was required. He came to the nurse's station at 10:30 with a tablet in his hand and the expression of a man who had made a decision and was implementing it before he could reconsider. Patricia was at the station. 2 other nurses were charting. Claire was reviewing the post-surgical note on patient 3, now identified as Staff Sergeant Gabrielle Ortega, 31 years old, which she had looked up not for professional reasons, but for personal ones, because Reyes had been standing against that OR wall for the better part of an hour, and she wanted to know the name of the man he'd been holding his breath for. Donovan, Harwick said. She looked up. I'm placing you on administrative suspension pending the formal review. He set the tablet on the desk. There was a form on the screen, half completed. You can finish your shift. I'm not removing you from the floor mid-crisis. But after today, you're on leave status until the credentials committee meets. Patricia stopped charting. The 2 other nurses also stopped with the particular stillness of people who are performing inattention. I understand, Claire said. I want to be clear, Harwick said, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before, not the flat dismissal he usually aimed at her. Not the surgeon's authority, but something slightly less certain of itself, something working harder than usual. This is not personal. This is about proper process and the integrity of the department. Yes, sir. The interventions you perform today will be reviewed for outcomes and for protocol compliance. If the review finds, Dr. Harwick, she said it quietly, not cutting him off exactly, but finding the word gap before he could fill it. I'm not going to fight the process. You don't need to build the case while I'm standing here. He stopped. She looked at him, at the face that she had spent 3 years interpreting correctly, and at which she was still looking with the same patient attention she'd always given it, seeing in it now something she hadn't quite seen before, or hadn't let herself see. A man who was not entirely comfortable with the position he'd put himself in, and who was covering the discomfort with procedure, the way people covered things they didn't want to examine with whatever structure was available. The pelvic hemorrhage on Ortega, she said. Did Pendleton give you the OR note? A beat. Not yet. When you get it, and I'm not saying this to argue my case, I'm saying it because it's clinically relevant. Look at the imaging timeline. The abdominal ultrasound at intake was negative for pelvic free fluid. The fast I repeated in the bay was positive. That's a roughly 14-minute window. The bleed evolved during transport and initial resuscitation. It wasn't a missed finding on intake, it was a developing one. She held his gaze. I want the review to have the correct clinical picture. That's all. Harwick looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he picked up the tablet and walked away. Patricia waited until he was out of range before she turned to Claire with an expression that had several layers to it. Are you actually not going to fight this? She asked. I violated protocol. You saved at least 3 people. Those aren't mutually exclusive, Claire said, and went back to the chart. The call came from the ER at 11:14. Not a formal page, a direct call from the triage desk to the nurse's station, which was unusual enough to register before Claire even picked up. The nurse on the other end was someone she recognized by voice from morning handoffs, a steady-natured man named Devlin, who did not generally call the floor directly during mass casualty follow-up. "We've got a walk-in," Devlin said. "Blunt trauma, head and upper body, says he fell. He's not on any of our patient lists." A pause. "He's asking for you." "For me specifically?" "By name. Your actual name, not the floor." Another pause, shorter. "He looks like he's been outside for a while, and his injuries don't match what he's saying about how he got them." She was already moving. "I'll be there in 2 minutes." She told Patricia she was going downstairs, did not stop for the elevator, and took the stairs at a pace that she would not have described to anyone as running, and that was functionally running. And when she pushed through the stairwell door to the ground floor, she was already assembling the picture from the available fragments, aware that she was making assumptions, aware that assumptions were dangerous, unable to not make them because the shape of what Devlin had described fit too precisely into the gap that Voss's account had opened. The man in the triage bay was sitting upright on the examination table with the deliberate uprightness of someone who was experiencing significant pain and had decided that showing it clearly was a tactical disadvantage. He was in civilian clothes, dark outdoor gear, the kind you bought for function rather than appearance. Not expensive. He had a laceration above his left eye that had been sealed at some point with wound closure strips applied by someone without medical training, close enough to correct to suggest basic first aid knowledge. His right side was guarded, the arm held slightly out from the body, the unconscious protective posture of someone with a rib injury managing their own breathing. His face was thinner than she remembered it. There were 3 years in it that hadn't been there when she'd last seen it. She stood in the doorway for 1 full second, which was longer than she needed to confirm what she was seeing and shorter than she needed to process what that confirmation meant. And then she crossed the room. "Mark," she said. Staff Sergeant Marcus Aldrich, formerly of the 75th Ranger Regiment, 2 tours in conditions not publicly documented, a face she had last seen in her own memory on the worst night of a year that had contained several candidates for that designation, looked at her with the expression of a man who had been trying to reach her for a long time and had finally stopped having to try. "Hey, Claire," he said. His voice was hoarse. She pulled on gloves and reached for his chin, tilting his head to assess the laceration. Her hands were doing what they did. She was aware of this from a slight distance, the clinical function running on its own track while the rest of her was doing something else entirely. "How long have you been out there?" she asked. "Since yesterday morning. I knew someone was watching the motel. I went out the back." "Where did you sleep?" "I didn't, really." He held still while she assessed the laceration. "The ribs are cracked, I think. 3 and 4 on the right side. Someone hit me with a vehicle. Not fast enough to be lethal. Just enough to be a message." She palpated the right lateral chest wall with focused precision, finding the point tenderness at the 3rd and 4th ribs, confirming the crepitus that told her the fractures were real. His breath sounds were equal. No tracheal deviation, no surgical emergency, but he was going to be in significant pain and the fall risk from the head injury needed evaluation. "Did you lose consciousness after the vehicle impact?" she asked. "Briefly, maybe a minute. After that? Headache, some nausea, cleared up. Pupils were equal after?" "I couldn't check my own pupils." "No, but you could check your visual field and your cognition. Did you?" He looked at her. "Yes." "And?" "They were normal." A pause. "I was a Ranger medic, Claire." "I know. I'm asking anyway." He let her ask. He answered everything she asked, and she built the clinical picture with the focused efficiency she always used, and which today had the additional quality of being performed over a substrate of something much larger. The thing that had been building since Voss said the name Aldrich in a hospital corridor, the thing she had been keeping flat and managed since then, which was getting harder to keep flat the longer she stood in this room. "Voss is upstairs," she said. "I know. I saw the vehicles in the lot." He paused. "I wasn't sure whether to come in." "What changed your mind?" "I've been trying to reach you for 6 weeks," he said. "I've been blocked and stonewalled and I think followed, and then someone tried to run me over with a pickup truck." He looked at her with the flat directness of someone who had run out of alternative strategies. "I figured the direct approach was worth trying. She set down the assessment kit and looked at him fully for the first time since entering the room. Not the clinical look, not the inventory of wounds and vital signs, but the look that acknowledged what was actually sitting between them in this small room, the history and the loss and the 3 years, and the name she had been carrying as a weight and a wound simultaneously. "The review," she said. "The incident record. Voss said your testimony was suppressed." "It was." "What does the testimony say?" He met her eyes. "It says you made every correct decision that night. It says the outcome was caused by failures upstream of you, equipment, intelligence, a command decision that was made without the information you had on the ground. It says the after-action finding that blamed you was written by someone who needed a name to put in the report, and yours was convenient." He paused. "It says PFC Hallett died because of systemic failures that had nothing to do with the care you gave him." The name landed the way it always landed, with the specific gravity it always had. The name of the 22-year-old from Tulsa who had died on a cold ground in the dark, while her hands worked over him, the name that she had carried out of that life and across 3 years of early morning shifts and deliberately unremarkable days. She sat in the chair against the wall. She was aware of sitting down in a way she wasn't usually aware of it. "Why was your testimony suppressed?" she asked. "Because the people responsible for the upstream failures were still in command," he said. "And because confirming that the after-action finding was wrong meant someone had to be wrong. And the someone who had to be wrong didn't want to be wrong." His voice was careful, not cold, but with the particular flatness of someone who had been angry for a long time and had moved through the anger into something on the other side of it. "Colonel Devin Prater," he said. "He wrote the finding. He suppressed my testimony. He's been running the advanced training program at Camp Reyes. Not that Reyes," he indicated the general direction of upstairs. "The facility." "Camp Reyes," she repeated. "He's been running it for 2 years. The training disaster today—" He stopped. "It happened on Prater's watch, on an exercise he designed." He looked at her directly. "This is the second time in 3 years that people have died on an exercise he designed. And both times, he's the one writing the after-action finding." She looked at the wall. She was thinking about the morning, the helicopters over the ridge, the men who had come through the ambulance bay doors, the young corpsman against the OR wall, holding his breath for the man who had pushed him clear. Petty Officer Lamb, 23 years old, dead at the site. "He's connected to the training program specifically?" she asked. "He designed the protocol they were running. I have documentation." Aldrich shifted slightly, wincing at what the movement cost him, and reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and produced a folded envelope. It was thick. He held it out. "Hard copy. I've been carrying it because I didn't trust the digital chain." She took it. She held it without opening it. "Claire," he said. She looked at him. "The things they said you did? That you failed, that you panicked, that your decisions cost him his life. There are people who know that's not true. There have always been people who knew. We just—" He stopped. "It took too long. I know it took too long. I'm sorry." She looked at the envelope in her hands. 3 years of morning shifts. 3 years of third-floor med-surg and early rotations, and Harold Pruitt asking about butterscotch pudding. 3 years of keeping her head down and staying in the background and doing the work that needed doing and not asking to be seen. She thought about Wakefield in the recovery bay. We don't see it the way you see it. She thought about Reyes's back against the wall, his eyes on the OR door. She thought about PFC Hallett, 22 years old, from Tulsa, who had deserved better than the record that had been written about the night he died, and who was the only person in this entire situation who couldn't speak for himself. She opened the envelope. The documents inside were dense, multi-page, the accumulated paper trail of an attempt to correct a record that someone had spent significant effort to cement. She didn't read them in full. There wasn't time, and the full reading would need to happen with Marsh and Osgood, and probably legal counsel. But she scanned them, the way she had been trained to scan documents for the load-bearing information, for the structural facts that held everything else up. What she found was worse than she had expected, not because the facts were new. She had known, in the private truth of her own memory, what had actually happened that night. She had known her decisions were correct, and she had spent 3 years failing to fully believe that knowledge, because a formal document had said something different, and documents had weight that memory didn't, But seeing it laid out in Aldrich's meticulous documentation, the timeline, the equipment failure reports, the communications logs, the command decisions, cross-referenced against the after-action findings that contradicted all of them, was different from knowing it. Worse, because of the second set of documents, the ones from the last 18 months, that showed Prater's fingerprints on the training program that had killed Petty Officer Lam today. Worse, because of the third document, which she almost missed because it was a single page near the bottom of the stack, and which was a memo dated 11 days ago. A memo from Colonel Devin Prater to a logistics coordinator she didn't recognize, referencing a security concern about a former service member in Creston Falls, Colorado, who had obtained sensitive documentation and represented a threat to ongoing operations. A memo written 4 days before someone had tried to run Marcus Aldrich over with a pickup truck. She refolded the documents and put them back in the envelope. "Voss needs to see these," she said. Her voice came out steady, which she appreciated in an abstract way. "I know," Aldrich said. "That's why I'm here." She stood. She had a great deal of things to do, and she was going to do them in the correct order, beginning with getting Aldrich properly assessed and documented as a patient, because he needed imaging and he needed his ribs properly evaluated, and whatever happened in the next few hours with the documents and Voss and Marsh and the investigation, he needed to not deteriorate in a triage bay while the rest of it unfolded. She was moving toward the door to find Devlin and get the imaging ordered when her radio crackled. Not the personal one, the hospital radio, the floor communication channel. Patricia's voice, tighter than Patricia's voice usually sounded. "Claire, can you come back up? Quickly." She stopped at the door. "What's wrong?" "Dr. Harwick is—" A pause, the pause of someone choosing language. "He's holding a department meeting, right now. He's got the nursing supervisor and 2 people from administration, and he's—" Another pause. "He's trying to have your license flagged." She felt the room change around her without moving. Not a suspension pending review. A license flag. That was a different category of action entirely. That was the kind of move that followed a nurse for years, that showed up in credential checks, that made the suspension look like a warning shot. "Who's in the meeting?" she asked. Patricia gave her the names. 2 hospital administrators she knew by face, the nursing supervisor. And a name she hadn't expected. Dr. Harwick had apparently called in Dr. Lloyd Sumner, the chief of medical staff, who outranked Harwick in the hospital hierarchy and whose presence meant this was no longer a department action, but an institutional one, which meant someone had moved fast, which meant someone had decided that the morning's events required a response that went beyond professional discipline and into something designed to preempt whatever came next. She looked back at Aldrich on the examination table. She looked at the envelope in her hand. She thought about Colonel Devin Prater's memo and the 11-day gap between it and today, and about the mass casualty event that had put his men and his training program under the most intensive scrutiny they had ever faced, and about the timing of Harwick's sudden escalation from suspension to license flagging on the same morning that Aldrich had walked into this hospital with documentation that could end Prater's career and potentially result in criminal referrals. She did not believe in coincidences at this scale. She had learned not to, a long time ago, in circumstances that had cost her the belief in them. "Patricia," she said into the radio, "stall them. I need 8 minutes." "How am I supposed to—" "You'll figure something out." She clicked off the radio and turned back to Aldrich. "Can you walk?" "Yeah." "Then come with me." She pulled open the triage bay curtain and found the corridor outside occupied by 2 people who were not hospital staff. The first was a man in tactical civilian clothing she didn't recognize, standing at the corridor entrance with the body positioning of someone who was not there accidentally. The second was Theodore Voss, who had apparently come downstairs at some point in the last 20 minutes, and who was standing 6 feet from the triage bay door with his phone in his hand and an expression that told her he had just received information that had moved things significantly beyond where they had been when she'd left him in the corridor upstairs. He looked at Aldrich. Something moved across his face. Recognition, and underneath it something more complicated. "Mark," he said. "Sir," Aldrich said. Voss looked at the envelope in Claire's hand. Then he looked at her face. I was good at reading faces. She had always known this about him, and whatever he read in hers moved him toward a decision quickly. "We have a problem," he said. "More than one," she said. "Prater is in the building." The words landed, and she felt the cold clarity of a situation that had just stepped past the point where any individual response could contain it. "Which floor?" she asked. "Administration," Voss said. "He arrived 20 minutes ago. He's with Dr. Sumner." He paused. "He requested the meeting." She thought about Patricia's call. Harwick, administration, the nursing supervisor, Dr. Sumner, a meeting that had assembled itself in the same 20-minute window in which Colonel Devin Prater had walked into the Vantage Point Medical Center administration floor. She looked at Voss. She looked at the envelope. She thought about every correct decision she had ever made in the dark, with her hands doing the only thing she knew how to do, trying to be enough, and the record that had been built over the top of those decisions, like concrete over evidence, and the 3 years she had spent beneath it. "He came here to bury this," she said. "Yes," Voss said. "He's not going to," she said. It was not a question or a declaration or the kind of statement that required an answer. It was just the fact of the thing, arrived at simply, the way certain facts arrived when you had run out of space to avoid them. She put the envelope inside her scrub top against her chest, where she could feel the edges of it, and she looked at Voss and Aldrich and the man in the corridor she didn't know, and she said, "Which stairwell gets us to administration fastest?" Voss opened his mouth. Before he could answer, the hospital PA system activated. Not the mass casualty alert, not a code, but the administrative intercom, the channel used for overhead announcements, the channel that reached every floor, every room, every corridor in the building simultaneously. The voice that came over it was not a voice she recognized, but the words it spoke were words she recognized, because they were her own, recorded at a quality that suggested a mobile phone held at a distance, in the corridor outside the triage bay approximately 4 minutes ago. "He came here to bury this." A pause. Then her voice again, flattened by compression and distance but identifiable, unmistakably hers. "He's not going to." The PA clicked off. The corridor was absolutely still. Voss was looking at the ceiling speaker with the expression of a man rapidly recalculating. Aldrich had gone very still in the way people went still when they were assessing whether they needed to move and in which direction. The man in the corridor had his hand moving toward something under his jacket that Claire registered and filed in the threat assessment part of her mind that never fully stopped running. She thought about the scope of what had just happened. Her voice on every floor, every patient room, the administration offices, Harwick's meeting, Sumner and Prater, and the administrators who had assembled in the last 20 minutes. Her voice saying that someone had come to bury something and wasn't going to succeed. Someone had just made sure that everyone in the building knew this was happening. She did not know whether that someone was trying to help her or destroy her, and in the 10 seconds of silence that followed the PA clicking off, she was not at all certain she was going to have enough time to figure out which. She did not know whether that someone was trying to help her or destroy her, and in the 10 seconds of silence that followed the PA clicking off, she was not at all certain she was going to have enough time to figure out which. Then Reyes's voice came from behind her. "That was me," he said. She turned. He was in the corridor entrance, weight on his good ankle, the other foot barely touching the floor, his phone in his hand. He looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of someone who had made a decision and was not second-guessing it. "I found the PA patch number in the hospital directory," he said. "It's listed under facility services. Anyone can call it." He paused. Seemed like the right time to make sure people were paying attention. Voss looked at him with the expression of a senior officer encountering an action that was simultaneously insubordinate and tactically correct, the expression that had no clean resolution. "Corpsman, with respect, sir," Reyes said, "people in this building needed to know something was happening before it got buried in a conference room." He glanced at Claire. "Same way things got buried before." The corridor was still for another beat. Then Claire said, "Stairwell," and Voss pointed left, and they moved. The administration floor was on the 4th level, reached by a stairwell that emptied into a carpeted corridor of a different quality than the clinical floors, quieter, the floors muffled, the lighting warmer, the whole atmosphere carrying the slight unreality of a space that had been designed to communicate stability and authority and was currently hosting something that threatened both. Claire went up the stairs at a pace that Aldrich managed behind her with the controlled discipline of someone suppressing the cost of each step, and Voss was on his phone, and the man in the corridor, whose name she still didn't know, had peeled off somewhere in the ground floor with a look at Voss that communicated something she wasn't party to. She thought about the PA broadcast as she moved. Reyes had made a calculation, a fast one, an imperfect one, the kind of calculation made by a 20-something corpsman who had spent his morning watching someone nearly die on his behalf, and had then spent an hour against a wall waiting to find out if that someone would live, which was the kind of morning that stripped away deliberation and left impulse with the controls. The broadcast had done something irreversible. It had taken the conversation out of the conference room in the administration corridor and put it into the air of the entire building, where every staff member and every patient who had been awake and every administrator who thought they were having a private meeting now knew that there was a conflict in this hospital that someone thought was worth making public. That was useful. It was also dangerous, in the way that irreversible things were always dangerous, because you couldn't control what people did with information once it was loose. She pushed through the stairwell door to the 4th floor. The corridor outside administration was not empty. There were 3 people in it. 2 she didn't recognize, 1 she did, a hospital administrator named Gail Ferris, who had processed Claire's original employment paperwork 3 years ago, and who was now standing outside the main conference room door with the expression of someone who had received news she didn't know how to categorize. Ferris looked at Claire. She looked at Voss. She looked at Aldrich's laceration and the way he was holding his right side. She looked at the phone in Reyes's hand. Reyes had apparently followed them up the stairs, which Claire noted without surprise. "That PA announcement," Ferris said, "was that—" "Yes," Claire said. "Is Dr. Sumner in the conference room?" Yes, he's in there with—" Ferris stopped. "There's a military officer. He arrived without going through the standard check-in process, and Dr. Sumner agreed to—" "Prater," Voss said. It was not a question. Ferris looked at him. "He presented credentials. He said it was a matter of national security?" Voss asked. "A beat." "Yes." Voss looked at the conference room door. Whatever he was thinking moved quickly across his face and then settled into something that Claire recognized as the pre-action composure of a man who was about to do something he had prepared himself to do. He looked at Dr. Marsh, who had materialized at the stairwell exit behind them. Claire had not tracked when she'd followed, and Marsh gave a slight nod. "Ms. Ferris," Marsh said, producing her credentials in the smooth, practiced way of someone who did this frequently. "My name is Dr. Felicia Marsh. I'm with the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. I need you to keep this corridor clear for the next 30 minutes, and I need you to not contact Dr. Sumner or anyone in that room until I tell you otherwise." She paused. "Can you do that?" Ferris looked at the credentials. She looked at Claire. Something in what she found in Claire's face, not a plea, not urgency, just the particular quality of someone who was telling the truth about a complicated situation, seemed to reach a decision point. "Yes," she said. She moved the 2 people she'd been standing with back down the corridor and positioned herself at the far end with the demeanor of someone doing her job, which in this moment was to do what she'd been asked. Voss looked at Claire. "When we go in—" "I'm not waiting outside," she said. "I wasn't going to suggest it." He looked at the envelope against her chest. "Give that to Marsh. She's the one with the authority to enter it into evidence. You having it is less useful than her having it." She pulled the envelope out and handed it to Marsh, who took it with the gloved hands of someone who had apparently been prepared for exactly this, and who slid it into a document sleeve she produced from the bag over her shoulder. Claire watched this and thought about Aldrich carrying those pages for 6 weeks, in a jacket pocket, through a motel and a pickup truck and a cold night somewhere in Creston Falls, and felt the weight of that transport translated into the bureaucratic care with which Marsh sealed the sleeve. "Ready?" Voss said. "I've been ready," Claire said. "For 3 years." She pushed open the conference room door. The room was mid-sized, the kind used for department head meetings and budget presentations, with a long table and chairs and a projection screen currently dark against the far wall. 7 people in it. Dr. Sumner at the head of the table. A tall man in his 60s with the silver-haired gravitas of someone who had run a hospital long enough to mistake institutional authority for personal authority. Harwick to his left, with a tablet in front of him and the expression of a man who had been in the middle of presenting a case and was now processing an interruption. 2 administrators Claire recognized as belonging to the compliance and legal functions. a woman she didn't know. And Colonel Devin Prater. He was in service dress uniform, the formal version, the kind that carried every credential and decoration in visible array. He was in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped graying hair and the physical self-assurance of a man who had spent his career in rooms where his rank established the hierarchy before he opened his mouth. He was seated at Sumner's right hand, which told her everything she needed to know about the first 20 minutes of this meeting, and he was looking at the door with the expression of a man who had calculated several possible interruptions and had responses prepared for each of them. His eyes moved across the group that had entered: Voss, Marsh, Claire, Osgood, Reyes in the doorway, and processed them in the order of his assessment of their threat level. He registered Marsh last, and the slight recalibration that moved through him when he recognized the IG credentials was the first thing in his expression that he didn't fully control. "Dr. Sumner," Voss said, before anyone else could speak. "I'm Theodore Voss, Naval Special Warfare Command. This is Dr. Felicia Marsh, DoD Inspector General, and Captain Renata Osgood, JAG Corps." He placed his own credentials on the table within Sumner's line of sight. "We need 5 minutes of your time before this meeting continues." Sumner looked at the credentials. He looked at Prater. Prater said, "Commander Voss." "Mr. Voss," Voss corrected pleasantly. "I'm retired." "This is a private administrative matter involving staff conduct and patient safety. It falls entirely within the jurisdiction of this hospital's leadership and has nothing to do with the 9 Naval Special Warfare operators who were admitted to this hospital this morning," Marsh said. "Following an incident at a facility under your administrative oversight, Colonel, suggests that it has quite a lot to do with you specifically." She set her document bag on the table. "I'd like to discuss that." The room had the quality of a pressurized space, everything in it running slightly above normal atmospheric weight, the kind of silence that wasn't comfortable for anyone but that different people managed differently. Sumner managed it by looking at his hands. Harwick managed it by looking at the table. The 2 compliance administrators managed it by looking at each other. Prater managed it by not moving at all, which was itself a kind of movement, the stillness of someone who had decided that inaction was the best available action. "I'm not going to discuss an ongoing operational matter in," Prater started. "This isn't a discussion about operational matters," Marsh said. "It's a discussion about a specific document record, a formal finding from 3 years ago, and evidence that that finding was produced fraudulently." She opened the document sleeve and placed 3 pages from Aldrich's package on the table in front of Sumner. She did not place them in front of Prater. "Dr. Sumner, the meeting you're currently holding was apparently convened at Colonel Prater's request, correct?" Sumner looked at the pages. He hadn't touched them yet, but he was reading the header. She could see his eyes moving. "He requested a meeting regarding a staff matter," Sumner said carefully. "The staff matter being Ms. Donovan's conduct during this morning's mass casualty response?" "Among other things." "And what were the other things?" Sumner looked at Prater. Prater said nothing. "Dr. Sumner," Claire said. Everyone looked at her. She was still near the door, and she had not moved further into the room, and her voice was the same voice it had been all morning, quiet, direct, not performing anything. "I'm not here to fight the suspension. I'm not here to argue about this morning's protocol decisions. Those things can go through the proper process." She looked at Sumner, not at Prater. "I'm here because a man is in the triage bay downstairs with cracked ribs and a head laceration from being struck by a vehicle yesterday, and that man has documentation that is now in Dr. Marsh's possession, and before this meeting makes any decision about my employment status, you should understand what that documentation contains and who else is in this room." Sumner's gaze moved to Aldrich, who was standing against the wall near the door with his right arm still slightly braced. The laceration above his eye was visible. The pallor of someone who had not slept and had sustained blunt trauma was visible. What was also visible to anyone paying attention was the particular quality of composure that came not from comfort, but from discipline, from someone who had decided that what they were about to say was important enough to say correctly, regardless of physical state. "My name is Marcus Aldrich," he said, "former Staff Sergeant, 75th Ranger Regiment. I was present at the incident on November 14th, 3 years ago, that resulted in the combat death of Private First Class Daniel Hallett and the subsequent finding against Claire Donovan." He paused for one breath. "I submitted a witness statement through proper channels 4 days after the incident. That statement was suppressed. I have attempted to resubmit through 4 separate channels over the past 2 years. I was blocked at each attempt. He looked at Prater. By individuals whose connection I can document. Prater's expression had not changed. This was, Claire thought, the most informative thing about him. The absolute command of surface, the professional lifetime of having his face tell the room only what he had chosen to tell it. It was a skill. She had encountered it before, in various configurations, and she had learned that the more complete the surface control, the more deliberate the interior calculation running behind it. Sergeant Aldrich, Prater said, with the measured tone of a man addressing someone he was choosing not to take seriously, "You've been separated from service for 18 months, Aldrich said. Separation that was recommended by a review board convened at your request." A pause. Small. "That's documented," Aldrich said, "along with the timeline of my suppressed submissions and the timeline of the review board. The gap between my 3rd suppressed submission and the convening of the review board is 19 days. Harwick had stopped looking at the table. He was looking at Prater now with an expression that Claire could not fully read, partly the expression of someone receiving information that was rearranging their understanding of a situation, and partly something more uncomfortable, the expression of a man who was beginning to understand that the meeting he had participated in convening might not be the meeting he'd thought it was. Marsh placed 2 more documents on the table. "Colonel Prater," she said, "I'd like to direct your attention to a memo dated 11 days ago, sent from your office to a logistics coordinator at the Camp Reyes facility, referencing a security concern about a former service member in Creston Falls, Colorado." She did not look up from the document. That memo was sent 4 days before Sergeant Aldrich was struck by a vehicle in Creston Falls. She looked up. "Can you tell me what prompted that security concern?" The room was very quiet. "That memo," Prater said, "pertains to an ongoing operational security matter and is not subject to—" "It's been entered into an active IG investigation," Marsh said, "as of 40 minutes ago, which means the operational security designation is superseded." She paused. "I'd like to give you an opportunity to characterize it in your own words before the formal interview." Prater looked at Marsh. He looked at Voss. He looked, briefly and with a quality she hadn't expected, at Claire. And what was in that look was not quite what she'd anticipated, which would have been contempt or dismissal or the professional blankness he'd been maintaining. What was in it was something more specific than any of those things. Assessment. The look of a man deciding how much she actually had. She looked back at him steadily and let him see whatever he found. He apparently found enough. "I'd like to speak with my JAG representative," he said. "Of course," Osgood said. "I'll need your phone in the meantime." "That's not—" "Colonel." Osgood's voice did not rise. "The device retention is standard procedure for the formal interview process. You're familiar with the process." She held out her hand. It was a small gesture. It carried the weight of a command. After 4 seconds, she counted them, Prater placed his phone on the table. Osgood picked it up, bagged it, logged it. The sound of the bag sealing was the loudest thing in the room. What followed was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. Investigations rarely were. The conference room became a coordination point. Sumner asked the compliance administrators to step out, and they went with the particular relief of people who had not wanted to be in the room for the last 10 minutes and were glad to have a reason to leave. Marsh sat up at one end of the table with her documentation and began the formal process of what she later described to Osgood as a preliminary interview, which was the language of the IG's office for something that was substantively more than preliminary. Voss made calls from the corridor. Osgood produced her own set of documents and began cross-referencing Aldrich's package against the records she had brought. Claire went back downstairs. Not because she was dismissed from the room, but because there were patients on the floors who needed someone to know where they were and how they were doing, and because the administrative and investigative machinery that was now running on the 4th floor was going to run without her input in a way that the patients were not. Reyes tried to follow her, and she pointed him back toward the conference room. "You need to give them a statement," she said. "I wasn't there 3 years ago." "You were there this morning," she said. "The training exercise, what you observed, who gave the orders, give them that." She looked at him. "It matters." He went back. She took the stairs to the 2nd floor, where 2 of the SEAL patients were in post-operative recovery, Wakefield and Bay 4, and a second operator named Brandt, who had come out of an abdominal washout procedure an hour ago and was in the light confused state of early post-anesthesia recovery. She checked both of them, noted vital signs, updated the charts, confirmed medication schedules with the recovery nurse. Then she went to the third floor and finished the medication round she had been in the middle of when the first helicopter came over the ridge. Harold Pruitt was awake and reading a magazine when she came into room 320, and he looked up with his characteristic squint and said, "I heard on the PA that something's going on." "There was an announcement," she said, checking his chart. "Wasn't an announcement. Was someone's conversation." He watched her. "Was that your voice?" "I'm checking your drain output, Mr. Pruitt." "I know what you're doing. I asked if that was your voice." She looked at the drain output, noted it was within normal range, marked it in the chart. She looked at Harold Pruitt, who was 71 years old and had spent 40 years watching young people from a football sideline, and who had consequently developed an extremely finely tuned capacity for detecting evasion. "Yes," she said, "that was my voice." Harold held her gaze for a long moment. "You going to be okay?" She considered this question with the seriousness it apparently deserved, coming from Harold Pruitt at 9 minutes past noon on this particular day. "I think so," she said. "Good." He went back to his magazine. Then, without looking up, "The butterscotch pudding, when you get a minute." "I'll find you butterscotch pudding, Mr. Pruitt." "No rush," he said. Harwick found her at the nurse's station at 12:45. She was updating charts, and he came to stand on the other side of the station counter, which put the counter between them, a geography she did not think was accidental. He was no longer in surgical gear. He had changed into his white coat, the formal attending version, which she read as someone who had needed to reassemble his professional identity after the last 2 hours, and had done it with clothing because that was what was available. He stood there for a moment. She continued charting and let him stand. "Marsh came to see me," he said finally. She looked up. "She's reviewing the mass casualty response documentation," he said, "as part of the investigation. She asked about the sequence of interventions. Who directed what? Timing." He paused. "I told her what I saw." She waited. "She also showed me part of the record," he said, "from 3 years ago, the finding." He looked at the counter between them. "I didn't know about that when I wasn't aware of your history when I made the staffing decisions I made." "No," she agreed. "That doesn't—" He stopped. Restarted. "It doesn't change that I treated you as someone who wasn't capable of things she was clearly capable of. That predates this morning. That predates the investigation." He met her eyes, and she found in his face the specific discomfort of a man who was not accustomed to this particular type of accountability and was doing it anyway, imperfectly, without the rehearsal that might have made it cleaner. "I don't know what I would have done if I had known who you were." "I don't know either," she said. He blinked. He had apparently expected something different from that response. "It's an honest answer," she said. "I don't know if knowing would have changed anything. I'd like to think it would, but the system here has been set up to treat certain people as certain things, and that predates you too." She looked at him steadily. "What I know is what happened this morning, what you saw, what the patients needed, and what got done." "The Ortega surgery," Harwick said. "Pendleton told me what the OR note says. If you hadn't flagged the pelvic source when you did—" "Ortega has a 4-year-old daughter," she said. "That's what matters." He was quiet. "The license flag," she said. "Withdrawn," he said. "I withdrew it an hour ago, before Marsh came to talk to me." He said this with a slight emphasis that she understood was important to him, that the sequence mattered, that he wanted her to know he had not done it because the investigation made it untenable, but because something in the previous 2 hours had changed the calculation for him independently of that. She accepted this, because it was the kind of distinction that was worth accepting. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He remained on the other side of the counter for a moment, as though there was something else, and then apparently concluded that what he had said was sufficient for now, and what remained would take time. He didn't have a right to expect her to give him. He went back toward the surgical wing. Patricia came to the station. She had been somewhere in the background of this exchange, with the studied inattention she'd been deploying all morning. She set a cup of coffee on the counter within Claire's reach without comment, which was a precise and correct read of the situation, and then went back to her own charting. Claire drank the coffee. It was bad coffee, the particular variety produced by the station machine that everyone complained about, and nobody fixed because fixing it would have required someone to make a decision, and decisions about non-critical equipment got deferred indefinitely. It was, in this moment, exactly what was needed. The escalation she hadn't anticipated came at 2:17 in the afternoon. She had been back on the floor for over an hour, doing the work that the floor required, moving through it with the accumulated momentum of a day that had asked a great deal and was apparently not finished. The investigation was running upstairs. The patients were stable. Wakefield had woken fully and eaten something and asked her twice about the rest of his team in the particular way of someone who was going to keep asking until he had a complete accounting. She had given him what she had, which was incomplete, and he had accepted the incompleteness with the patience of someone who understood that information moved at its own speed. The call came from Marsh's number. "I need you on 4, Marsh said. "Now." "What happened?" "Prater has an attorney on the phone. The attorney is claiming that the documentation Aldrich provided was obtained through a breach of classified material handling protocols and is moving to have it excluded from the investigation on national security grounds." A pause. "It's not going to work, but it's going to delay everything while the claim is adjudicated. Possibly for weeks." Claire put down the chart she'd been holding. "But that's not the primary problem," Marsh continued. "The primary problem is that Prater also submitted a counterstatement about an hour ago in writing, which his JAG rep apparently had prepared in advance." Another pause. "He's acknowledged the after-action finding was flawed. He's conceding that there were upstream failures. That's—" She stopped. That was the acknowledgement she had spent 3 years without. "Then what's the problem?" "He's conceding the upstream failures," Marsh said, and simultaneously attributing them to a different source. He submitted a statement claiming that the training program failures, both 3 years ago and today, were the result of intelligence and medical assessments provided by operators in the field who were relying on protocols developed by personnel he's now identifying as inadequately vetted. She understood before Marsh finished the sentence. "He's shifting the record," she said. "He's trying to redirect the attribution," Marsh said. "He's acknowledging something went wrong to preempt our finding, and simultaneously building a new document trail that points away from his decisions and toward field personnel." A pause. "He's very good at this." "I know," Claire said. "He specifically named you," Marsh said. "Not in the original finding. He can't walk that back. It exists. But in the counter-statement, he's created a new record claiming that protocols you developed during your service were factors in both incidents." She stood at the nurse's station and felt the specific quality of this, which was the quality of a trap that had been constructed well and in advance by someone who had known this day was coming and had prepared for it the way a careful and intelligent man prepared for a contingency, not by preventing it, but by controlling the narrative around it. "Is there anything that counters the claim about the protocols?" she asked. "Yes and no," Marsh said. "The documentation Aldrich provided covers the original finding. It doesn't directly address protocol attribution because that's a new element. He's introducing it in the counter-statement. To counter it properly, we need evidence about what protocols were actually used and who actually developed them." "The operators," Claire said. "The ones who are here. They were at the training. They know what protocols they were running." "We need formal statements," Marsh said, "from people who were present and can speak to what they observed." She thought about Wakefield in Bay 4, awake and asking about his team. She thought about Reyes upstairs giving a statement about the morning. She thought about Coble with his shoulder immobilizer and the compound frustration of a man who was injured and grounded and furious about both. "How long do I have?" she asked. His attorney is using the classified material claim to buy time. "I have maybe 4 hours before that creates procedural momentum that's harder to reverse." "That's enough," Claire said. She went to Bay 4 first. Wakefield listened to what she told him without interrupting. She gave him the complete version: Prater, the counterstatement, the protocol attribution claim, the 4-hour window. Because he was a chief petty officer with enough operational experience to handle the complete version and enough at stake personally to deserve it. His face went through several things while she spoke, most of them in the territory of controlled anger, the kind that had direction and consequence rather than just heat. When she finished, he said, "You need statements. Formal ones. On record. Whatever you were briefed about the training protocols, whatever you observed about how decisions were made on that exercise. I'll give you a statement," he said. "Get Osgood in here." You're post-surgical. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He met her eyes. Get Osgood. She got Osgood. She went to Coble next. He gave her 15 seconds of resistance on the grounds that he was in a shoulder immobilizer and currently unable to type. And then he said, find me something to record on, and I'll give you everything I have. And she found him the tablet the orthopedic consult had left, and he used the voice dictation function with the particular focused intensity of a man who was going to be heard. Brant was still emerging from anesthesia and was not a reliable witness for another 2 hours at minimum. The two walking wounded who had come in on ground transport, she tracked them to a waiting area on the second floor where they had been given food and were sitting with the particular contained restlessness of people who had been through something significant and were now waiting for someone to tell them what happened next. Both of them gave her statements, verbal, witnessed by a floor nurse she pulled in for the purpose, covering what they had been briefed before the exercise and what they had observed during it. Reyes she found still on the fourth floor, outside the conference room, sitting in the corridor with his taped ankle extended and his back against the wall in what had become his characteristic position. He had already given his statement to Osgood, he told her. He had covered the briefing, the exercise design, the command decisions during the incident, and the specific protocols they had been told to follow. Did you cover who told you to follow those protocols? She asked. Yes. And what did you say? I said we were briefed by command staff, he said, by Prater's direct reports. They didn't reference any field personnel development. They didn't reference you or anyone like you. He looked at her directly. Because that's the truth. She leaned against the wall beside him. She was tired. The specific kind of tired that came from hours of high-demand work, followed by hours of high-demand conflict, was different from regular fatigue. It sat in the chest rather than the limbs, a heaviness of continuous engagement that didn't respond to the fixes that worked on physical exhaustion. Reyes, she said. Yeah. When this is over, you need to actually get the ankle fixed. He looked at his foot. I know. You've been weight-bearing on it for 6 hours. It's not the most uncomfortable thing about today. She didn't argue with that, because it wasn't arguable. She went back upstairs to Marsh with 6 statements and the documentation Osgood had been building in parallel, and she sat down in the conference room that had emptied of Prater. He was in a separate room with his JAG representative, which was where the investigation required him to be, and she laid out what she had in the organized way she had always laid things out. The way she'd learned when the organization of information was the difference between a correct decision and an incorrect one. Marsh read through it. She made notes. She asked 2 clarifying questions. Then she said, the counterstatement is going to be significantly harder to sustain against this. Is it enough? It's enough to prevent the protocol attribution from establishing itself as the primary narrative, Marsh said. Whether it's enough to move the investigation to formal referral is a separate question that involves people above my pay grade. She looked at Claire. But the direction of it is clear. Claire looked at the table, at the documents on it, Aldrich's pages in their evidence sleeve, Osgood's supplementary documentation, the 6 witness statements in various formats. The paper accumulation of a truth that had existed for 3 years without a surface to rest on. She thought about the morning, which had started with a medication cart on the 3rd floor, and Harold Pruitt's question about pudding and the sound of rotors over the ridge. Where is Prater now? She asked. Room 311, Marsh said, with his representative. She paused. He hasn't requested to leave the building, which is interesting. He can't leave the building, Claire said. Leaving would look like flight. He knows the optics. She thought about the assessment look he'd given her in the conference room, the look of a man calculating what she had. He came here to shut this down quietly. He needs to leave here with it still contained or the containment fails. She paused. He's not done moving pieces. Marsh looked at her. He's been in that room for 2 hours, Claire said, with his JAG representative, on a phone we haven't accounted for. The beat of silence that followed was the beat of something clicking into place for both of them simultaneously. Marsh reached for her own phone. Before she could dial, the door to the conference room opened. Gail Ferris was in the doorway, with the expression of someone carrying information they had been reluctant to carry and had run out of time to not carry it. She looked at Marsh. She looked at Claire. There are 2 men in the lobby, she said. They arrived 5 minutes ago. They're asking for Colonel Prater. She paused. They're not military. They don't have hospital credentials. The security desk ran their names through the standard visitor system and got... She stopped. Nothing, No record, no identification that matches anything in the system. Marsh was already on the phone, Claire was already on her feet, and from somewhere down the corridor, from the direction of room 311, came the sound. Quiet, the kind of sound that buildings absorbed and distributed, and most people didn't consciously register, of a door opening. The sound of that door was quiet enough that most people wouldn't have caught it through the ambient noise of the corridor, the HVAC hum, and the distant voices, and the building's persistent mechanical undertone. Claire caught it because she had spent years training herself to catch exactly that kind of sound, the specific acoustic signature of a door being opened with deliberate care, the sound of someone trying not to make a sound. She was moving before she had consciously decided to move. The corridor between the conference room and room 311 was 30 feet of carpeted administrative hallway, and she covered it in the way she covered distances when something was wrong, which was not running but close enough that the distinction was mostly technical. She came around the corner and found the door to 311 open, 6 inches, and the room on the other side of it empty. Empty of Prater, empty of the JAG representative, whose name she still hadn't learned, containing only 2 chairs pushed back from a small table and a water glass, and the particular settled stillness of a space that people had recently left in a direction other than the one they were supposed to use. The window. She crossed to it. 3rd floor? No, 4th, she recalculated. The administration floor was the 4th. The window looked out onto the east side of the building, a service road below, a parking structure adjacent. The window was unlocked. It had not been opened. There was no disturbance in the interior surface grime that would have shown passage through it. She looked at the room again. The water glass. It was still sweating slightly with condensation. The water in it was 2/3 full. That was recent. Prater and his representative hadn't been gone long. She went to the door at the far end of the corridor she hadn't used. A secondary access, the kind that existed on every institutional floor as a fire egress, and that didn't connect to the main stairwell. She pushed it open. The stairwell smelled of concrete and fluorescent light, and below her, echoing upward from 2 or 3 flights down, she heard the sound of footsteps moving fast. She took the stairs. She was not thinking about the 2 men in the lobby at this moment. She was thinking about the door she'd heard opening, and the empty room, and the condensation on the glass, and the calculation she was doing about how much of a head start that represented, and where those stairs came out, which she knew because she had memorized the floor plan of this building 3 years ago. The way she memorized the floor plan of every building she spent significant time in, not from paranoia, but from the same practical habit that had once kept her alive in places where exits mattered. The stairwell came out on the ground floor into a service corridor behind the hospital kitchen. Not the main lobby, not the emergency entrance. The service exit, loading dock, dumpsters, a chain-link gate that opened onto the service road. She pushed through the door to the service corridor. Prater was 20 feet ahead of her. I was in his service dress uniform still, which was almost absurd given the context. The formal decorations and the polished brass looking entirely wrong in a corridor that smelled of industrial cleanser and food waste. His JAG representative, a young man who looked genuinely frightened, who was clearly carrying out instructions he had not fully understood when he agreed to them, was half a step behind him. And behind Claire, she heard the stairwell door open again. Voss. Moving faster than she'd expected for a man his age. Prater heard it too. He turned. The 3 of them looked at each other in the industrial lighting of the service corridor, and what passed between them in that moment was not the dramatic confrontation of people who had prepared dramatic speeches. It was the flat recognition of people who each understood exactly where they were and what the moment contained. "Colonel," Voss said from behind Claire. His voice was conversational, the tone of someone commenting on weather. The lobby entrance was the correct exit. Prater looked at him. He looked at Claire. He looked at the chain-link gate at the end of the corridor, which was 30 feet away, and which, if he reached it, gave him the service road and whatever was waiting on it. Claire moved sideways to block the corridor width. She was not a large person. She was aware of this. She was also aware of the specific geometry of the corridor and the distance and what she could and couldn't do, and she had spent enough of her life making accurate assessments of those variables to know that the geometry here was in her favor. "This is obstruction," Prater said. "I'm a nurse," Claire said. "I'm concerned about a patient. You have a head laceration." She looked at him, and there was in fact a mark above his brow she hadn't noticed before, something that had happened and been managed at some point. and I need to assess you before you leave the building." The absurdity of it landed in the corridor and sat there. Prater's jaw moved. Then Marsh's voice came from the stairwell door, brisk and official, and with the backing of institutional authority that overrode whatever calculation Prater was still running. "Colonel Prater, I need you to come back upstairs. You're not under arrest. But if you walk out that door, I will request that you be detained, which will take approximately 4 minutes to execute and will be considerably more visible than what's happening right now." She let that settle. "Your choice," Marsh said. The JAG representative made the choice for him, in the pragmatic way of someone who understood that his own career was the thing most immediately at risk. He put his hand on Prater's arm and said something quiet, and Prater's shoulders moved. A breath, a release. The specific physical surrender of a man who had calculated and found no viable path. He turned around. He walked back toward the stairwell. He did not look at Claire as he passed her. She watched him go and felt, in the place where she had expected relief or satisfaction, something more complicated than either. A tiredness that went below the physical, and underneath that, something that was not quite the opposite of tiredness. A small and stubborn thing that she didn't have clean language for, but that had been in her chest all day, present in the needle decompression and the pelvic ultrasound and the conversation with Wakefield and the stairwell and every moment between, the thing that had moved her forward from the elevator to the trauma bay this morning and had not stopped moving her since. Voss fell into step beside her as they followed Prater back up the stairs. "Nice work," he said. "I told him I needed to assess his head laceration." "I know, I heard." A pause. "Is there actually a head laceration?" She glanced at him. "There might be." He made the sound of a man who had found something approximately humorous in the worst day he'd had in recent memory, which was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family. What happened next took hours, not minutes, and was unglamorous in the way that the resolution of serious institutional failures was always unglamorous. Not a scene, not a moment, but a sustained and procedurally dense unfolding that required patience and precision and the willingness to sit in a conference room while people with authority to act used that authority incrementally, in the order the process required. Prater was formally interviewed under caution. His JAG representative, who had by then visibly recalibrated his own position and was giving advice that prioritized his client's remaining options rather than his original strategy, recommended limited cooperation on selected elements in exchange for procedural considerations. Marsh, who had seen this calculation before and many times, noted the cooperation on record and continued building the evidentiary picture around it rather than relying on it. The two men in the lobby, the ones with no matching identification in the system, were detained by hospital security, and Voss's contact, the man in the tactical civilian clothing whose name Claire eventually learned was Sandifer. They were held in the security office on the ground floor, and their identification was run through channels that took 40 minutes, but produced results that Osgood brought upstairs with an expression that Claire read as the satisfaction of someone whose working theory had been confirmed. "Private contractors," Osgood said. "Both connected to a logistics firm that runs contracts under Prater's training program." She set the documents on the table. "Both have prior employment history that suggests their expertise is not in logistics." "They came to help him leave," Voss said. "That's the working assumption," Osgood said. "Whether they were also connected to the vehicle incident involving Sergeant Aldrich is a separate investigation that I've referred to the appropriate people." Aldrich, for his part, had been assessed properly by the second-floor emergency team. His ribs confirmed at 3 and 4, no pneumothorax. The head laceration properly cleaned and sealed with the correct materials rather than improvised ones. He sat in a patient bay on the second floor for most of the afternoon, which he appeared to accept as a fair trade for the hours he'd spent managing those injuries without treatment, and he gave a formal statement that Osgood's team recorded in the thorough and exhausting way that formal statements were recorded. At 4:53 in the afternoon, Marsh called Claire into the conference room. Voss was there. Osgood was there. Sumner, the hospital chief of medical staff, was there, wearing the expression of a man who had spent the last several hours making rapid and uncomfortable revisions to his understanding of events that had occurred under his institutional roof. "I want to give you a summary of where we are," Marsh said. "Not the complete picture, the investigation is ongoing and will be for some time, but the elements that directly concern you." Claire sat down. "The original finding from 3 years ago. The finding attributing fault to you in the incident resulting in the death of PFC Hallett has been formally flagged for review by the IG's office as of 2 hours ago. That flag initiates a mandatory review process that will result in a formal determination. Based on the documentation and the witness statements we have, I am confident in characterizing the direction of that determination. She paused. The finding was not supported by the factual record. The factual record shows you made correct decisions under severe operational constraints. The outcome was caused by upstream failures unrelated to your conduct. The room was quiet. That determination will be formal when the review is complete, Marsh continued. That takes time. But the flag itself has already been entered into the official record, which means the existing finding no longer stands as the operative characterization of that incident. 3 years. Claire sat with that for a moment. The particular texture of 3 years, the weight of something you carry so long it stops feeling like something you're carrying and starts feeling like part of your own architecture. The way grief did, the way certain losses did, the way the record had. She sat with it and felt the weight of it shift, not disappear, not evaporate with clean relief, but shift, redistribute into something she might eventually put down. She looked at the table. "And Prater?" she asked. Colonel Prater is the subject of a formal IG investigation covering the suppression of Sergeant Aldrich's testimony, the retaliatory actions taken against Sergeant Aldrich, potential misrepresentation in after-action reporting, and his role in the administrative and operational decisions that contributed to today's training incident. Marsh's voice was steady and exact. He has been placed on administrative hold pending the investigation. He will not return to the training program. A pause. The formal consequences will be determined through the investigation and any subsequent proceedings. That process has its own timeline. What does that mean practically? Claire asked. It means he will not be doing to anyone else what he did to you, Voss said from across the table. He said it plainly, without elaboration, and she accepted it in the same register. Sumner cleared his throat. He had the manner of a man who had prepared remarks and was no longer entirely confident in them, but was going to deliver them anyway because the alternative was silence, and silence was worse. Ms. Donovan, he said, on behalf of Vantage Point Medical Center, I want to acknowledge that the circumstances of your employment here, the staffing decisions, the restrictions on your rotation, the events of today, reflect institutional failures that I intend to address formally. He paused. Beginning with a comprehensive review of credentialing protocols and the criteria used to determine clinical scope. He was not specifically saying that Harwick had been wrong, because institutional leaders rarely said the specific thing, but he was saying everything adjacent to it in a way that made the specific thing unnecessary. Thank you, Claire said. She meant it, even knowing that institutional acknowledgments were not the same as individual accountability, and that the review process he was describing would be slow and imperfect and would fix some things and miss others. She meant it because something in the direction of right was still something in the direction of right, regardless of speed. She went back to the floor at 6 o'clock. The day shift was ending and the evening shift was coming on, and the handoff was happening at the nurses' station with the exhausted efficiency of a team that had processed something they had not been trained for and had processed it anyway. Patricia was briefing the evening charge nurse with the focused completeness of someone who was not going to cut corners on this particular handoff, regardless of how long the day had been. Claire stood at the edge of it and listened, filling in details Patricia flagged, until the evening nurse had what she needed. Then she went room to room. Not because she was on shift, she was not, and everyone was aware she was not, but because the patients were hers in the sense that mattered, the sense that had nothing to do with schedules, and because the ending of a shift had never been the ending of that relationship as far as she was concerned, and she wasn't going to start now. Wakefield was sitting up, eating what appeared to be hospital lasagna with the focused displeasure of a man who would eat it regardless of displeasure because he needed the calories and knew it. He looked up when she came in. The team, he said. Brandt's out of recovery and stable. Cobal's shoulder is immobilized. He's going to hate the next 6 weeks, but he'll be fine. Reyes is in surgical consult for the ankle, scheduled for tomorrow morning. She paused. Ortega made it through. He's in the ICU. The surgeons are cautiously optimistic. Wakefield put down the fork. He did this deliberately, with the particular care of someone managing a significant response. Lamb, he said. I know, she said. There wasn't language that was correct for that, and she didn't try to find it. She stood in the room with him for a moment in the way she had stood with people in the worst moments, not filling the space but not leaving it either, present in the way that presence could be useful when nothing else was. "What happens now?" he asked. "With Prater, with the investigation." "It moves forward," she said. "It takes time, but it moves." He looked at her with the direct assessment she had recognized as his characteristic mode since she'd found him on a stretcher at 6 in the morning. "And you?" "I'm going to finish my shift." "You're not on shift." "I know," she said. He almost smiled. It didn't quite reach the full construction of a smile, but the shape of it was there. "Widow," he said. "Don't," she said. "I'm going to anyway." He met her eyes. "We've been carrying you with us since you left. The ones who were there, the ones who knew." He paused. "You should know that." She looked at the window. Outside, the Colorado evening was coming down over the ridge line, the light going low and golden over the mountains, the kind of end-of-day sky that this place produced reliably and that she had stopped noticing at some point and was noticing now. "Get some sleep," she said. "You had surgery 8 hours ago." "Yes, ma'am," he said with the specific tone of a man who used that form of address as genuine rather than ironic, which was different from most of the ways she'd heard it used. She went to check on Harold Pruitt last. He was asleep, which was correct for this hour, and his vitals were stable, and his drain output was within normal range, and there was a small container of butterscotch pudding on the tray table that someone from the evening shift had apparently located, and which he had clearly not waited to eat because it was empty. She recorded his evening vitals, noted everything was stable, and stood for a moment in the dimmed room listening to him breathe with the uncomplicated depth of a man who had finished a hard day and surrendered to sleep without apparent difficulty. She thought about what he'd asked her that afternoon. "You going to be okay?" The way he'd asked it, not with pity, not with the particular gentle condescension of people who thought they were being kind, but with the straightforward interest of someone who actually wanted an accurate answer. She thought her answer had been correct. She thought so. Marcus Aldrich was being discharged from the second-floor bay when she found him, sitting on the edge of the examination table in his outdoor gear, the wound above his eye, properly dressed now, his ribs wrapped, his face carrying the specific pallor of someone who had been through too much in too short a time and knew they were going to feel it more tomorrow than today. She sat in the chair against the wall. They were quiet for a moment in the way of people who had a great deal to say and were deciding where to begin, or whether to begin, or whether the accumulation of the day had already said enough of what needed saying that the rest could wait. "The review is going to take time," she said. "I know." "Months, probably." "I know that too." He looked at his hands. They were the hands of someone who had done physical work and sustained physical damage and were currently wrapped around each other in the way hands wrapped when the person they belonged to was managing something that didn't have a physical location. "Claire," he said. "Mark. I should have found a way earlier." His voice was flat in the register of someone who had rehearsed this and was now delivering it and finding that rehearsal had not prepared them adequately. "I should have—" "You tried," she said. "You were blocked. I tried the official channels. I should have—" He stopped. "You would have been putting yourself further at risk." "I was already at risk." He looked at her. "I should have found you directly, 2 years ago, before it got to where—" He made a gesture that encompassed the day, the ribs, the investigation, the accumulated weight of 3 years and a record, and a woman in a mountain town doing early shifts on a medication cart. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she wanted to say, which was complicated by the fact that she had several true things available, and they pulled in different directions. She had spent 3 years being angry at a record, and not being able to be angry at people because anger at people required engagement with people, and she had been trying to exist in a space that didn't require that. She had some anger available for Mark Aldrich, and it was legitimate, and she knew it was legitimate. She also knew that he had cracked ribs and had spent 6 weeks trying to reach her, and had been hit by a truck, and had walked into this hospital today with an envelope of documents folded against his chest, and had given his formal testimony with a head laceration that was still new. "You found me," she said. "That's what happened today." He was quiet. "I was angry," she said. "I'm still angry, in parts. That's not going to resolve today." She held his gaze. But I'm not angry at you specifically in a way that's useful to either of us right now. So let's table it. He accepted this with the recognition of someone who understood that it was more than he'd had any right to expect and was not going to argue with it. "Where are you going?" she asked. "After tonight. I have a contact in Denver who can house me while the investigation runs." He paused. Voss offered to coordinate. Apparently there are protocols for witnesses in active IG investigations. "Use them," she said. "Don't try to do the next part alone." Says the woman who spent 3 years in a mountain town doing it alone. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Exactly." He absorbed that. She stood up. "The ribs are going to hurt more in the morning. Take the medication as prescribed. Don't try to walk it off. Sleep on your left side." She looked at him. "I mean it about the medication." "I know." She put out her hand. He looked at it for a moment, at the hand, at her, at the particular geometry of a gesture that was doing several kinds of work simultaneously, and then he took it. They shook hands in the second-floor bay of Vantage Point Medical Center with the specific formality of people who had too much history for informality and too much uncertainty about what came next for anything warmer. And it was not a perfect moment. It was not clean or resolved, but it was real in the way that mattered, the way that moments between imperfect people in the aftermath of hard things were real. Not satisfying exactly, but true. The formal outcomes arrived over the following weeks and months, not in a single dramatic event, but in the accumulated sequence of institutional processes running to their conclusions. Colonel Devin Prater was relieved of command pending investigation, a status that became permanent when the IG's review produced findings that were referred to the appropriate military judicial authority. The 2 private contractors detained in the security office were charged with offenses that the investigation connected credibly to the incident involving Aldrich. The training program at Camp Reyes was suspended for comprehensive review, and the exercise protocols that had governed the morning's disaster were flagged for root cause analysis by an independent body. The after-action finding from 3 years ago was formally vacated. This was entered into Claire's service record as an official correction, not a footnote, not a revision, but a direct acknowledgement that the original finding had been produced with falsified and suppressed evidence and did not reflect the factual record of PFC Hallett's death or the conduct of the personnel who had been present. It did not bring Daniel Hallett back. She had known it wouldn't. She did not need it to. What she needed it to do was say clearly, in the permanent language of official record, that she had not failed him, that the people who had failed him were the ones who had been writing findings, rather than the one who had been on the ground with her hands trying to save him in the dark. It did that. That was enough. Dr. Harwick appeared at the nurses' station 11 days after the mass casualty event with a formal letter from the Credentials Committee reinstating Claire's full clinical scope and clearing her to participate in trauma rotation. He delivered it without ceremony, sliding it across the counter in the way of someone completing a transaction, and she accepted it in the same register. 2 weeks after that, he appeared again. This time he stood at the counter for a moment before saying anything. "The Ortega case," he said. "I presented it at the Department M&M conference, the timeline, the imaging sequence, the decision to repeat the fast." He paused. "The consensus was that the second fast caught a finding that would not have been caught otherwise for at least another 20 minutes. "I know," she said. 20 minutes would have been too late." "I know that too." He stood at the counter. He was not a man who apologized naturally. She had concluded this over 3 years of observation, and the conclusion had not been revised by the last several weeks. What he was, she had concluded more recently, was a man who expressed accountability through action more readily than through language, and who was currently trying to find the language because the action wasn't enough for this particular debt. "I judged what I saw," he said. "I saw a quiet nurse on the morning shift who didn't push back and didn't seem to want anything more than her assignment. I used that to decide what she was worth." He looked at her. "That was on me, not on you." She thought about what to say. She thought about several things she could say, some of which were easier and some of which were more true. "You judged the uniform I wasn't wearing," she said. He absorbed that. It landed the way she had known it would land, with the precision of a thing that was accurate enough to not require follow-up. "Yeah," he said. "I did." The silence between them was not comfortable, but it was honest, and she had developed a preference for honest over comfortable somewhere in the process of the last several years, and did not see that preference changing. "The trauma rotation," she said. "When does it start?" Something shifted in his face. "Whenever you want to." "Next week," she said. "Next week," he confirmed. It was Reyes who said the thing that stayed with her. He came back to Creston Falls 6 weeks after his ankle surgery, not for follow-up. He'd had that in a military medical facility closer to his base, but deliberately, specifically, because he had apparently decided this was something he wanted to do, and Reyes, she had concluded, was the kind of person who did things he decided to do without waiting for a more convenient time. She found him in the hospital lobby on a Tuesday morning, walking without a visible limp, which she assessed with the automatic clinical eye she could not turn off, and which told her the fixation had healed well. They went to the cafeteria. She got coffee. He got something he described as tea, and that resembled tea only approximately. He told her about the investigation, what the operators had been told, what the formal process had produced so far, the status of the inquiry into the training program. He told her about Ortega, who was out of the ICU and home, who had apparently sent a voice message to the hospital that had been passed around the nursing staff and that Claire had not heard because she had been in the trauma bay when it circulated. Then he was quiet for a moment. "Can I say something?" he asked. "You've been building toward it for 10 minutes, she said. He looked at his approximate T. "When I was against that wall," he said, waiting to find out if Gabe was going to make it, I kept thinking about something you said. In the triage bay. When I told you he'd pushed me clear." He paused. "You said, 'That's what people do for each other.'" She remembered saying it. "I've thought about it a lot," he said, "because it's such a simple thing to say, and it's true. But the thing I keep coming back to is that you spent 3 years hiding what you could do, what you were, because someone built a record that said you'd failed someone you were trying to save." He looked up from the tea. "That's the opposite of what people do for each other. That's someone using a record to make sure you couldn't do for anyone else what Gabe did for me." She held her coffee cup. "Prater spent 3 years making sure you stayed hidden," Reyes said. "And you spent 3 years trying to stay hidden because you believed something that wasn't true about yourself." He paused. "And then 9 people came through the door, and you—" He stopped. Started again more carefully. "You came out of wherever you'd been keeping yourself, and you just did what you do, because that's what you do, even after all of it." She looked at him. He was 23 years old and recovering from an ankle surgery and drinking bad tea on a Tuesday morning in a hospital cafeteria in Creston Falls, Colorado, and he had just said the most precise thing anyone had said to her in the entirety of the last several months, possibly the last several years, said it without drama and without the sense that he was trying to say something memorable. She thought about Daniel Hallett, 22 years old, from Tulsa. She thought about the record that had been written over his death and over her presence at it. She thought about the morning shift and the medication cart and Harold Pruitt's butterscotch pudding and the sound of rotors over the ridge. She thought about the things she'd been carrying versus the thing she actually was, and the gap between those two that she had been living inside, and what it meant that the gap was finally beginning to close, not because someone had told her it was allowed to close, but because a morning had come that didn't give her the option of keeping it open. "You should have been a philosopher," she told Reyes. "I'm a corpsman," he said. "Both," she said. He finished the tea. He looked at the table. Then he said, "Is it okay that I came back?" She considered the question seriously, the way she considered things that deserved to be considered seriously. "Yes," she said. "It's okay." He nodded. He looked like the weight of something he'd been carrying for 6 weeks had redistributed slightly, which was not nothing, which was in fact the kind of thing that mattered more than it was credited for mattering. There is something that nobody tells you about the moment when a wrong is corrected after a long time. They tell you it feels like justice. Sometimes it does. They tell you it feels like closure. Sometimes that too, though closure is a word that overpromises what it delivers. What they don't tell you is that it also feels like grief, briefly. Grief for the years the correction couldn't reach, for the time spent inside something that should never have been built, for the version of yourself that endured it and cannot be fully recovered because that's not how time or people work. Claire drove home from the hospital on a Tuesday evening, 6 weeks after the morning. The helicopters came over the ridge, and she sat in her car in the parking lot of her apartment building for approximately 4 minutes before going inside. And she let herself feel all of it in the specific way she had learned to feel things. Not suppressed, not performed, just present with the actual weight of the actual thing, the complicated and non-cinematic reality of a person sitting with the truth of her own life and finding it was more than it had been told to be. She was 34 years old. She had cracked ribs on a man with a family. She had found a pelvic hemorrhage in a 14-minute window. She had taken a needle to the second intercostal space of a man who recognized her from a different version of her life, and who had said her name in a hospital in Colorado and rearranged everything. She was 34 years old and she had a trauma rotation starting Monday and a formal record that finally said what had actually been true all along. And somewhere in this city, a man named Aldrich was sleeping in a safe location for the first time in months, and a man named Ortega was home with his 4-year-old daughter, and a man named Hallett could not be brought back but could at least be correctly remembered. She was not fine in the simple sense that word gets used. She was something more durable than fine. She was a person who had been reduced to her outline by a system that had decided what she was worth and had spent 3 years proving, quietly, in the early morning light, in the unremarkable accumulation of correct decisions and cared for patients, that the system had not known what it was looking at. She got out of the car. She went inside. On Monday, she walked into the trauma bay at 7 in the morning, scrubs on, coffee in hand, and nobody told her to go back to her floor. The morning team moved around her with the natural adjustment of a group that had reconfigured its geography around a new constant. Patricia was there, cross-training for a trauma certification she had apparently decided to pursue approximately 3 days after the mass casualty event. 2 of the overnight residents were at the board, updating status. A new attending she hadn't met yet looked up from the intake terminal and said, "You're Donovan?" "Yes," she said. "Heard a lot about you," he said. "Good things?" He considered this with more seriousness than the question required, which she immediately liked about him. "Interesting things," he said. "Come look at this chess film and tell me what you see." She set down her coffee and looked at the film. The work was the same as it had always been. The accumulation of observations and decisions, the small corrections that prevented large failures, the sustained attention that most people mistook for passivity because it did not make noise. She had always been good at it. In the conditions where she had first learned it, and in the 3 years of med-surg mornings, and now in the trauma bay with the film in front of her, and the morning coming in through the windows, and the radio on the wall crackling with something incoming. She told the attending what she saw. He listened. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. Not recognition as absolution, not approval as permission, just the ordinary fact of a person doing work they were built for, in a room that had finally stopped pretending they didn't belong in it. Some people spend their lives waiting to be seen clearly by the people around them, needing that recognition to believe in what they know they are. Claire Donovan had learned, at cost, over years, in the specific hard way that certain lessons arrive, that she did not need the room to see her. She needed to show up. The room would catch up or it wouldn't, and her job was the same either way. She had shown up, and the rest had followed.